greetings to our keynote speaker, Ms. Lisa Rice, panelists, and all learners. Welcome to the 2021 Annual Fair Housing Community Conference. My name is Sandra Collins, and I am the chairperson for the Raleigh Fair Housing Hearing Board. On behalf of the Fair Housing Hearing Board, we're extremely proud and excited today about the opportunity to engage with our community and partners to participate in discussing things pertaining to your rights under the 1968 Federal Fair Housing Act and the city's Fair Housing Ordinance. The mission of the Fair Housing Hearing Board is to provide education, outreach, and awareness of laws against discrimination in housing opportunities because of race, color, religion, national origin, sex, familial status, or disabilities. The conference is entitled Restructuring Institutional Reform and the Rights of People with Disabilities. Today, we're bringing you a level of expertise that will address the issues, share their knowledge, and hopefully solutions to the challenges regarding housing discrimination that severely impacted individuals with a criminal history and people with disabilities. Everyone deserves housing and a roof over their head. And to think or believe otherwise is beyond discrimination. It's a system that's broken. So we welcome each of you to our conference and wish that you leave informed, empowered, and ready to advocate for the rights of housing and justice. Thank you. I bring before you now Mr. Jeff Dillon with Legal Aid of North Carolina.
Thank you very much, Sandra. And I want to welcome everyone to today's conference. As Sandra mentioned, I'm Jeff Dillman. I'm the co-director of the Fair Housing Project of Legal Aid of North Carolina. And I want to thank our partners, the City of Raleigh Fair Housing Hearing Board, for helping us put on this conference, as well as the staff of the Fair Housing Project, Jack Holtzman, Kelly Clark, Lauren Brazil, Jennifer Lozano, and Drea Johnson. And I also just want to also thank the Department of Housing and Urban Development for their support, financial support for helping us put on this event. As Sandra mentioned, the Fair Housing Act was passed 53 years ago in April of 1968. And while the Fair Housing Act has been a very powerful tool for addressing discrimination for thousands of individuals across the country, we also have to acknowledge how much remains to be done. The goals of the Fair Housing Act are not merely to end discrimination, but also to address housing segregation, and in particular, the racial and national origin segregation that exists throughout much of North Carolina and the country as a whole. As a wide variety of research has shown, where people are born, what zip code or neighborhood they grow up in, has a huge impact on their lives. It affects the quality of the schools they can attend. It affects the amount of pollution they're exposed to, the availability of jobs and parks, groceries, and other amenities. It affects the amount of money they're going to earn in their lives and be able to pass down to their children. And as we've been reminded, especially this past year, it often affects how the police interact with them and their neighbors. And so before I turn to the first panel, I want to read a quote about the task that's before us. And this quote is also from 1968, when the Fair Housing Act was passed. And it comes from the Kerner Commission that was established to look into the causes of the racial unrest that occurred in many communities in the 1960s. And the commission said in their final report, "It is time now to turn with all the purpose at our command to the major unfinished business of this nation. It is time to adopt strategies for action that will produce quick and visible progress. It is time to make good the promises of American democracy for all citizens, urban and rural, white and black, Spanish surname, American Indian, and every minority group. We hope that this conference will help inspire and energize you to help us address this unfinished business that's before us." And with that, I would like to introduce Wanda Gilbert Coker. who is a member of the Raleigh Fair Housing Hearing Board and who will be moderating our first panel addressing discrimination experienced by people with criminal histories. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. Good morning to all. Thank you for participating. And we are going to make this a great day. I am your moderator, Wanda Gilbert Coker. And this morning we have fabulous presenters. And see, if as we move along, you can put your questions in the question and answer session, and we will get to those in the end. This session, we're going to have 20 minutes for question and answer and 15 minutes per speaker. Our topic this morning is renting with a criminal history, using fair housing law and advocacy to challenge housing discrimination. This morning we have with us attorney Dawn Blagrove, who is the Executive Director of Emancipate NC. Dawn Blagrove is an attorney and proud graduate of Florida Agricultural Mechanical University, FAMU, and North Carolina Central Law School. She obtained her Bachelor of Science degree in Political Science with a minor in secondary education and master's degree in Applied Social Science, both from FAMU. Blagrove has emerged as a leading voice in North Carolina, demanding an end to mass incarceration and the dismantling of systemic and institutional racism. Blagrove constantly engages in community conversations challenging the status quo. Today, Blagrove's experience as a conviction attorney, combined with her undergraduate training in secondary education, fuels her passion for educating youth and public about challenges in the criminal justice system as Executive Director of Emancipate NC. Our next presenter is going to be Keisha Millett, who is a staff attorney with the Fair Chance Project. As a North Carolina, she is a North Carolina native, and she is deeply invested in uplifting community and challenging harmful policies and practices of state and local institutions. Her work primarily focuses on driver's license restoration and fair chance housing and employment. Keisha attended law school at UNC Chapel Hill. She is a proud graduate at Hampton University and Howard University. And next we will have Kieran Pittman, who is joining us as well, who is a community activist and field director at Emancipate NC. Kieran Pittman was born in Germany, but was raised in Raleigh, North Carolina. He is the founder and executive director of Recidivism Reduction Educational Program Services, REPS, a nonprofit geared towards reducing recidivism rate in North Carolina. Kieran is a field director of Emancipate NC, a nonprofit slated towards combating structural racism in the criminal justice system. Kieran also sits on the state of Reentry Council, created and headed up by North Carolina's Governor Roy Cooper. Kieran also sits on the Task Force for Racial Equity and Criminal Justice, headed up and created again, as I said before, by Roy Cooper. Thank you for joining us, Dawn, Keisha, and Kieran. This morning, as I said before, we're going to discuss renting with a criminal history, using fair housing law and advocacy to challenging discrimination. Good morning to all of you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
As I stated, the question and answers can be, the questions can be put in the question and answer, and we will get to them right now. Each presenter will have 20 minutes to present. And first, we're going to start with Dawn Blagrove.
Good morning, everyone. I'm happy to be here. Thank you for having me and for this important topic. This morning, we are here to talk about, or I am here at least, to talk about the collateral consequences of being and the impact of being justice involved on housing insecurities and what it looks like and what we need to do as a community to make sure that folks who are coming home from having been involved in the carceral system are able to secure housing and are able to successfully matriculate back into society. But there are substantial barriers, and that's what I want to talk about a little bit this morning. So just to ground us in this conversation, 1 in 3 people in the United States have a criminal record, meaning that they are subject to somewhere in the neighborhood of 44,000 associated legal sanctions and consequences to having been justice involved. Those things involve, those collateral consequences include being able to find gainful employment, being able to take care of their children and have access to their children, volunteer at their kids' schools, and barriers to housing, not being able to get housing for a multitude of reasons. It is important that we understand that there is an intersectionality between being justice involved and being impoverished, being poor. Very, very often we have seen an epidemic in America of criminalization of poverty. That is a state of existence that exacerbates those collateral consequences that exist for people who are justice involved. And it also grossly increases the chances that if a person is Black, brown, indigenous, and poor, that they are going to have negative interactions with the criminal justice system. It simply feeds upon itself. So criminalizing poverty is part and parcel to the problem of securing housing, because poor people in general are already housing insecure. What we know for sure is that in Raleigh, like I'm sure Wanda will talk about later on, there is, and all across the country, there's a level of gentrification that is happening in communities that normally house Black folks who are living under the poverty line. As those people are pushed out of their permanent homes and the communities where that had been carved out for them, that had been created for us by a racist and an economically racist and institutionally racist systems about housing gerrymandering, where they created a places for us, for poor Black people, poor brown people to live. Now that they want to reclaim those spaces, we are being pushed out. And as we are being pushed out to nowhere, because there is no real, just like there was no real intentionality or concern about the ability to prosper when they created the small communities and spaces that they gave to us to live in initially. There's also being no real intentional or deliberate consideration about where they're pushing us to. And that is true of all poor folks. And it is true across the country, especially in North Carolina, and specifically we can see it in Raleigh. That then is exacerbated, like I said earlier, by being justice involved. What we know is that Black and brown people are disproportionately involved in the criminal justice system. Roughly, while in America, Black folks roughly make up about 15% of the population, we make up somewhere in the neighborhood of 49% of incarcerated people anywhere in the country. Also, and those numbers hold true roughly in North Carolina as well. And what that means necessarily at the intersection of housing and being justice involved is that there is a disproportionate number of us who are facing collateral consequences due to criminal justice involvement with housing insecurities and barriers to housing. So let's get into what some of those barriers look like. What we know for sure is that because people are poor and they cannot afford housing, especially as gentrification ravishes and grossly inflates the cost of being able to afford a a habitable place for poor people, what we know is that those folks typically are getting, if they're lucky, are getting some kind of government assistance to help them offset the exorbitant and exaggerated costs of just maintaining a home for their families. What we know for sure is that being justice involved necessarily means that that access to some of that federal funding to help offset the cost of incredibly high rents is not available to families who are justice involved, who have been justice involved. In North Carolina, for example, we just recently, 2019, raised the age for juveniles to be treated as adults from 16 and 17 up to 18, but only for low-level felonies and misdemeanors. Prior to that happening, though, if you were a mother of a 15, 16-year-old kid who got in trouble at school, for example, with maybe having some weed or some marijuana in his pocket, and your child lived with you and you were living in subsidized housing, your child ends up with the felony conviction. You then, as a mother, have to make the choice of whether or not you are going to stay in that housing, in the subsidized housing, and put your child on the street because he has a felony conviction and is unable to live there, or whether or not you move your whole family out and all of your children out of this secured housing that you have so that you can keep your family intact. That is just one example of the ways that being collaterally impacted by being justice involved can impact housing securities. But another thing, and I think this is more important, not more important, but just as important, is without having bail reform in place in North Carolina, what we see very, very often is that even before a person has a criminal conviction, a family is forced to make a very tough decision about whether or not they are going to try to bond out their family member or maintain their marginal financial status quo. Let me explain that. So, very often, if you go to jail and you are given a bond, whether you are convicted of that crime or not, you sit in jail until you are able to go home, period. If you cannot afford to buy your freedom, you sit in jail awaiting trial. For many, many poor people, bonds are set at a place where they are unable to financially afford to pay for that bond, so they sit in jail. Now, here's what happens. Let's say you have a kid named Christopher. Christopher is 19 years old. He has a child, a girlfriend. They are maintaining a stable household. They have a rent that is on a studio apartment that is costing them, that has raised from the $650 it used to be up to something crazy like $1,200 because they live in an area that's being gentrified, and so that now their rent has gone up exponentially, right? So they're just able to afford to stay in their home. Christopher is arrested and sent to jail. He is set with a $1,500 bond. These folks do not have a $1,500 bond, so Christopher sits in jail. They don't have $1,500 to pay. They don't even have what it would take to get a bail bondsman to pay for the rest of the bond. Because here's how bail bondsmen work, right? So your bond is $1,500. Even though you pay a bail bondsman 15-20% of that, $300, okay? That $300 you don't get back. It is non-refundable. That bail bondsman then pays for your family member to come home. And if your family member goes back to court, the bail bondsman gets back the $1,500 he or she put up. But you do not get that $300. That is $300 that is gone from your family budget. Now, most poor people, most middle-class people cannot afford to lose $300 without feeling the negative consequences of losing that money in their monthly budget. So what happens? This person sits in jail, say 3 days. Christopher has a job at Walmart. You know what happens to Christopher's job at Walmart if he doesn't show up for 3 days? Christopher's going to get fired. Christopher's going to lose that job. So now he's lost his job, and this one family that was a 2-income household is now a 1-income household. 1 income is no way that they are going to be able to maintain the life that they have. Just from being in jail for 3 days, it can completely upend the lives and the housing security of this family. So they can't make their rent, they are now evicted, okay? Now, not only do they not have a place to live, if they want to try to find other suitable housing, even comparable to the housing that they just lost, they have to have a first month's rent, a last month's rent, and be able to overcome the obstacles of a landlord being concerned about Christopher spending 3 days in jail and having been evicted. It is imperative that we figure out ways as a society to make it possible that our criminal justice system does not act as an albatross around the necks of poor people. One of the ways that albatross is harming the people who are deeply impacted by the criminal justice system is by making it impossible for them to afford, maintain, or acquire affordable housing. It is so important that we discuss this issue as it relates not just to poor people, but poor people who are just as involved, because the only way that we can really reacclimate our brothers and sisters behind the wall who are coming home to be successful is for them to be able to meet their basic needs. That means they need housing, they need food, they need money. Right now, the way our systems are set up, people who are coming home, people who are justice involved, simply do not have access to the basic fundamental human needs. And that has got to change.
Wow, thank you for that, Dawn. So early in the morning, but powerful, and I just thank you for that. Next, we are going to move to Keisha Millette. As I stated before, she is an attorney she's a staff attorney with the Fair Chance Project. Good morning, Keisha. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you so much. I am going to share my screen. I have a PowerPoint for you all this morning. Okay. Just have to confirm that you all can see the first slide. Okay, great. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about barriers to housing access and some local solutions for people with criminal records. I will say that Dawn really got to the heart of the issue, and so there's certain things that I may just brush very lightly on, kind of based on what she's already elaborated on. So first, why should we care about housing access for folks with criminal records? Housing is a human right, as has been stated several times before me, that there shouldn't be a question of whether or not someone has a place to live. It's one of several basic needs that can ensure safety in community. So when we're thinking about what keeps us safe, being housed keeps us safe. Having access to food keeps us safe. Housing access is a race and class issue, as was broken down by Dawn earlier. And it's something that impacts many, many people across the country and in the state of North Carolina. And these barriers impact families and not just individuals. Can you see this? Okay, great. Okay, sorry. what does it mean to have a criminal record in North Carolina? What does that actually look like? So in North Carolina, your criminal record reflects conviction offenses. So it shows if somebody was convicted of a misdemeanor or a felony. It also shows whether somebody was arrested and charged with a misdemeanor or felony. So that could include charges that were dismissed or disposed of not guilty, somebody pled to a lesser offense, or a deferred prosecution or diversion. One of the really big challenges with that is someone who looks at a criminal record, sees these arrests, sees these non-convictions, and assumes someone's criminality, and frankly sees someone's convictions and assumes their criminality. But just noting that North Carolina in particular is one state that includes charges even where somebody was not actually convicted. And so there's kind of a list of entities that can get their hands on these charges and convictions. So that would be courts and different state, local, and federal agencies, DPS, the DMV, private background check companies. And one of the challenges with that is the private companies may not have up-to-date information. They may not have accurate information. And frankly, if somebody is able to get their record expunged, or basically that record of conviction or arrest cleared off of their record, it still may show up on a check through one of these private background companies if they're not updating the information. And then the media. This can be a particular challenge, particularly where the media may have access to mugshots or other things that reflect on someone's conviction or charge that person may have to continue to live with, even after they've moved on with their lives, even after they may have gotten their record expunged. People in North Carolina are facing a lot of difficulty right now with getting their mugshots removed. So I'm providing a very short list of housing access challenges. I imagine there are other folks in the room that know of others. Please feel free to put it in the chat. But something that Don mentioned earlier, this high risk of eviction, kind of these tough decisions families have to make if one of their loved ones gets convicted of a felony in particular. Limited access to transitional housing available for folks returning home from prison. Limited affordable housing stock to begin with. A very much lack of transparency around rental restrictions. So somebody applying to live somewhere that may be affordable and having to guess whether or not their application will be denied. And then that cost burden that comes with that. So that $25 or $35 adding up every single time. Discrimination that someone may face by public and private landlords based on this record of conviction or arrest, and then other additional burdens, location-based restrictions for folks who are on the sex registry. So what are some protections that we can offer? So we can start with the Fair Housing Act. So the Fair Housing Act protects people from discrimination. According to the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the Fair Housing Act protects people from discrimination when they are renting or buying a home, getting a mortgage, seeking housing assistance, or engaging in other housing-related activities. And there may be additional protections for federally assisted housing. And so there are certain properties that are covered under the Fair Housing Act. Generally, very broadly, most residential units, residential rental units, or single and multifamily housing people may own, group homes, shelters, long-term transient lodging, with some exceptions. And who must comply with the Fair Housing Act? So almost anyone who is either selling or renting or managing property must comply with fair housing laws. And that gets all the way down to employees or maintenance workers, real estate agencies, homeowner associations. And so there are certain protected classes under the Fair Housing Act. So it prohibits discriminatory misconduct or discrimination against people based on their race, color, national origin, religion, sex as in gender, their familial status, their disability, and then in North Carolina specifically, affordable housing. So in the case of someone who has a record of criminal conviction or arrest, if that person submits an application for housing and faces discrimination based on one of these protected classes, one of these protected categories, then that person may potentially have a claim under the Fair Housing Act. So just by way of quick example, if there is a Black person with a misdemeanor drug conviction who submits an application to an apartment complex, and a white person with the same misdemeanor drug conviction who submits an application to an apartment complex, and they have basically the same rental history, the same background, but the Black person gets denied, that person may have a claim under the Fair Housing Act due to discrimination based on race. So HUD offers some general guidance for folks who have criminal records. So a criminal background screening may constitute a discriminatory effect. There need to be a fact-specific and case-specific inquiry. And in order to justify a particular policy around criminal records, then that housing provider must provide a substantial, legitimate, non-discriminatory interest supporting that policy. For example, this policy is in place because this specific denial of someone with this particular criminal conviction will promote resident safety or will protect the property. But having some blanket ban, just like, nope, you can't, if you have a criminal record, you can't come here, that's not specific enough. So exclusions based on arrest. So arrest records are not proof of past misconduct, which makes it incredibly frustrating because they show up on North Carolina background checks, on the criminal record in North Carolina and on background checks. All that they say is that someone may have been suspected of an offense. And as I think Don already spoke to, we recognize that Black and brown communities and poor communities in particular are targeted by policing. And so this rate of suspicion ends up basically the impacts being both racist and classist. And so arrest records are also often incomplete. They are just not a reliable basis to determine someone's risk to safety or property. And so a provider just can't satisfy a burden of showing that policy or practice, that kind of policy or practice, denying someone based on a arrest record is necessary to achieve what HUD describes as a substantial, legitimate, non-discriminatory interest. So exclusions based on conviction. So a conviction record generally does have enough evidence to prove that someone engaged in criminal conduct. So again, there could be a risk of the record being outdated or there being an error. It's simply the wrong person. But otherwise, the provider must still prove that the policy is necessary to achieve this substantial, legitimate, non-discriminatory interest, but they can't have a blanket ban in place. So I want to share a little bit about the North Carolina Housing Finance Agency criminal background model policy. And that's particularly in place for certain properties, including those that receive low income housing tax credits. And so under this model policy, they must, this type of property owner or landlord must let an applicant know that they can submit mitigating information or information that would otherwise make the seeing someone's criminal record be less severe or be less harmful to that person. Inappropriate cases. They must do a conduct check on each adult over 18. And if they find negative information and plan to deny that person, they must give them notice and an opportunity to dispute the accuracy of the information. And if that applicant does not dispute the accuracy of that information within 10 days, then that property must provide written notice that the person is not eligible to stay on that property. So there's a chart that is offered that helps clarify this, and I won't get into all the details, but just to say that depending on the type of the conviction, there may be an automatic exclusion period, an individualized assessment period where the property owner can decide based on maybe mitigating information that's provided or other information to accept that person. And then in certain cases, that person may not be excluded, even though that record, a period of time that person may not be excluded, even though they have that record on their background. So just hopping to one example, a felony involving sale or manufacture of a controlled substance. So in this case, for properties that would be covered here, there may be there's an automatic exclusion period of 0 to 5 years under this model policy. And then from 5 to 10 years, an individualized assessment period where the property owner may, based on certain information, decide it's okay to admit this person, or they may decide to reject that person. But then after 10 years, that person may not be excluded based on that conviction for felony involving sale or manufacture of a controlled substance. So there's some ways that attorneys in particular can advocate for their clients who may have a criminal record. So first, as I mentioned, many criminal background reports contain errors. It's not the right person. There's a completely different birth date. This actually didn't happen. Whatever it might be, that's something to watch for. You can get a copy of a person's criminal record free from the North Carolina Department of Public Safety, or pay for it from the State Bureau of Investigation. And certainly there are other ways to check criminal records, such as going to the courthouse and looking at that Cypress system. And make sure to carefully review this with the client. It's very easy to see someone has a similar name, but it's a county that your client may have never visited. So that kind of thing comes up. There are a lot of attorneys at Legal Aid of North Carolina who work on providing expunctions and also have resources available about pro se assistance, pro se guidance on someone filing their own expunction. The North Carolina Justice Center also has a 2020 expunction guide available online. I will say that because the Second Chance Act was passed in summer of 2019, there are some updates to eligibility for expunctions. So I'll try to move quickly because I know I'm taking up some time. So there's certain mitigating factors that we can consider, such as how long was the client incarcerated? What's the evidence of rehabilitation? Is there support from religious leaders or employers? Other strategies: ask the housing provider to provide a reason for denial. Request a copy of reports or documents that are actually used to deny the application. And you can see under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, the consumer has 60 days to request. Getting a copy of criminal history and eligibility. Consider possible fair housing claims. Just very briefly, there are other things that property owners can do that have been done in different parts of North Carolina and other parts of the state. Be very transparent upfront about what restrictions are in place for people with criminal records so that they don't have to guess when they're submitting an application. Or potentially consider joining with other landlords in the community to accept a universal application and certified background so that applicant doesn't have to pay multiple fees. Or consider returning a fee if somebody is rejected. other innovative solutions very briefly. Housing co-ops such as mobile home parks that folks may agree to purchase together and not have the same restrictions that may be in other places. Shared housing such as low-cost room rentals, transitional homes and sanctuary type housing through religious institutions, and then state level action, reentry reinvestments, really the state using funds that are available to the state in order to support reentry service providers and reentry housing providers. I just want to really shout out the Fair Housing Project of Legal Aid of North Carolina and National Low Income Housing Coalition. They provided a lot of the information that's provided in this presentation, and the material in this presentation is for information and educational purposes and does not constitute legal advice. This is just a list of sources and my contact information if you have additional questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Attorney Millette. A lot of great information was presented there. As we move along this morning, we're going to move to Kieran Pittman, who is a community activist and a field director at Emancipate NC. Good morning, Kieran. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. So my name is Kerwin Pittman. I'm a social justice activist, also field organizer for Emancipate NC, also the executive director of recidivism reduction educational program station that pretty much help individuals coming home post-release parole kind of get back on their feet. And so this right here is a very important topic as it relates to individuals coming home and the reentry process of them coming home. And so the main components that I see and I deal with individuals coming home, they need the basic 3 essentials that I call it. And that's basic essentials for any human life. And that is food, shelter, and clothing, right? And so where does the housing aspect fit into this thing? It is shelter. Shelter is very important because when you have nowhere to stay, the likelihood of really reoffending is very, very high. When you need money, the likelihood of reoffending is very, very high. When you have nothing to eat, the likelihood of reoffending is very, very high. And when you are Black with these components, it just exacerbates the process of you really going back into the criminal justice system. And all of this may have started due to lack of housing. You was released without a reentry plan. And so it is dealing with individuals like this on this basis that we find a real barrier. Finding housing for individuals coming from the reentry space and those who are just as involved. And so what a lot of people really don't understand and really may not think about is when individuals just enter the criminal justice system, regardless if they go into the carceral system, meaning prison or jail or not, being that they just may get a felony on their record and may have bonded out. This felony may prevent them from receiving adequate housing. So you may not even be coming from prison, yet because you caught a felony, it's hard for you to get housing. You'll face discrimination from landlords, as the previous speakers have spoken. Not only that, you could be staying with somebody trying to get back on your feet, and the landlord or somebody who's renting to you find out and say, hey, you know, what's up with this individual? We didn't do a background check on this individual. And there you go. So now your loved one is put in a rock and a hard place. Do I put my loved one out, or do I just move with my loved one? And a lot of the times, especially coming from marginalized community, we don't possess the economic capacity to just move on a drop of a dime. And so that leaves this individual back on the streets looking essentially for these 3 essentials, which honestly stems from money, which is food, shelter, and clothing. So we try to provide these individuals with jobs as well as housing. And so we are extremely thankful for individuals, not particularly on this call, but also those who may not be on this call who kind of advocate in this space of housing for those with disabilities, because whether you know it or not, having a criminal record, that is a disability. I just named the components of the barriers that they face. If this is not a disability in a sense and fit into the disability category, I don't know what is. Not only do I not have a job, I don't have food or nor shelter, nor do I have anybody to help lift me up. This is an extreme disability. Not only that, coming from the marginalized community, who we know are targeted disproportionately when it comes to the criminal justice system by law enforcement, that is even more of a barrier. And so what do we have? We have a growing homeless population. And it is individuals who are not homeless by choice, but by circumstance. And this is where individuals like you guys and us come into this space and kind of advocate and kind of help put contingency plans in place for these individuals to say, how can we best help support these individuals' needs and assist this most marginalized community and assist this disability community at the same time to uplift them and put them where they need to be. And so it is going to take more strategizing. It's going to take more galvanizing of the people. It's going to take more education of these individuals. A lot of people coming home from the carceral system do not even know the options of where they're going to stay. So prime example, right now during this pandemic, COVID-19, 3,500 individuals were slated to be released through a joint lawsuit against the state. And I got to give kudos to Emancipate NC, not because I work with them, but because they do extremely great work when it comes to tackling structural racism within this criminal justice system. And so through litigation from the attorneys on Emancipate NC, they was able to secure the release of 3,500 individuals due to the COVID-19 pandemic from North Carolina prison system. So now the question is, where do these individuals go? Because a lot of these individuals do not even know that they was getting out. Remember, this came through a lawsuit, so their release date may not have even been met yet. So they're just getting a knock on their cell door or getting a tap on their bunk and saying, hey, can you come to the office? And when they get in the office, the case manager is filling them in, saying, hey, we're about to release you tomorrow. Do you got anywhere you can go? A lot of individuals, particularly within that system, do not have no place they can just go to on a drop of a dime. Those who are lucky enough to have a support system are grateful, and they are extremely lucky and blessed. But I'm looking at the reality of it. A lot of people don't have a place that they can just say, well, I'm going to call my mother, auntie, or my wife. And so they're putting these individuals within what we call motels. We call it a COVID motel because they send them to this motel if you have nowhere to go. Normally they would send them to a shelter, but they can't send them to a shelter due to the pandemic because they got the quarantine for 15 days. So the state set up something called the COVID motel, where they send them to this motel for 15 days, which is great for 15 days. You got a roof over your head and you got your $40 gate check, but you still don't have too much clothing, what you can borrow. So you got shelter for 15 days, but after that 15 days run out and your $40 run out the first 2 days, I'm pretty sure the first day, then what? Because you wasn't expecting to be released. And so it's transitional houses that need to be put in place, and we need to kind of strategize around and have more within this state to kind of help and be prepared for instances like this. And the pandemic taught everybody new lessons in life. And this is one of the lessons that it taught us, to be prepared at any moment to take these individuals coming home to really help them with a space to transition into and get back on their feet. Now, back to this person who just came to this transitional house. Where do they go from there? So it's day 14 for me. Where do I go? What do I do? The likelihood of you finding employment within 15 days when you're saddled with a felony, when you just got out unexpectedly, is extremely hard. You're trying to reacclimate back into society. All this is new to you again. So where do you go? You go to a shelter or you wander the streets, and this is how you become homeless. And it is that easy. And I use that example in that instance to show you it is that easy for you not to have no shelter over your head. And if you don't have shelter, I'm telling you, you resort back to the basic essentials of life. The basic essentials of life. Because I know how I am if I don't get a good night's sleep. So I can only imagine. And I'm heart go out to individuals sleeping on the street due to no circumstances of their own, but just being in a system that really did not prepare for them to re-enter. And this is where individuals fall through the cracks and the crevices. But if you add substance abuse and mental health illness on top of that, it is extremely, extremely hard. And we must continue to fight for these individuals. And this is where my organization and a host of other organizations try to in the gap. And we know that housing is a great thing if you have it, but if you don't have it, it is very detrimental to your success. And your success or failure will pretty much depend on those three essentials of life that I just named: food, shelter, clothing. Food, shelter, clothing. And if you saddle with a felon, it's hard for you to even get a job now, let alone rent an apartment when they run the background check. But also that, even if they run the background check and you meet the requirements, say if you have a sexual related crime, there's certain areas you can't even stay in. And so it just makes the experience in real life circumstances of re-entering back into this society extremely hard, especially if you're coming from the marginalized community, to find housing, particularly when you're saddled with a criminal record, because your community has been targeted disproportionately by law enforcement. And you just, some of these felonies you may have acquired due to instances of your own. I've met certain circumstances where individuals honestly didn't do it, but due to lack of representation from lawyers within the criminal justice system, persuaded them into taking a plea so they could come home. Unbeknownst to them, when they get sentenced to this plea, it wasn't the time that they thought they was going to get. So the house that they did have when they came home, it's gone. Why? Because they're not able to provide rent, to pay the rent to keep that house up, or the mortgage to keep that house up. So they come home to nothing, ground zero, with no family to help lean and assist on. Then what? And these are the barriers that we face within North Carolina, across the state, across the country, but right here in our area as well. Don't think that this story that I just spoke of is not tailored to some far-fetched place in California, because this is happening right here within the triangle. And I'm gonna be honest, it is happening right here within the triangle. I work based in the triangle and I deal with situations like this all the time. And it breaks my heart from lack of resources, lack of re-entry houses, lack of renters trying to loved ones' houses due to the landlord finding they were staying there. This breaks my heart. And so we must fill in these spaces and these gaps and catch the individuals that are falling through the cracks of this broken criminal justice system. To at this point, honestly, I feel like cannot even be reformed. We have to overhaul, meaning we're gonna have to break it down piece by piece and transitional housing and helping these individuals coming home post-release parole really get back on their feet. Even when it comes to housing, is one of those pieces that we're gonna have to overhaul, because we see the state is gonna put you out on the street or in a homeless shelter or with a $40 gate check. Now you go pay your rent with $40. You go buy your food, shelter, and clothes, your 3 essentials, the basic essentials of life, with their $40 gate check. And so the story that I told, please keep in mind when you find or come up with somebody against somebody who have this type of issues that they're having with housing, because you never know their background, you never know what struggle they've been through, and just try to assist them in any way possible. Was for to assist, because I know their struggle and I see bigger. And sometimes just that helping hand may change the trajectory of whether they go back into the carceral system or whether they stay out of the carceral system. Sometimes your words of encouragement may change the trajectory of whether they reoffend that day or whether they help and give them the motivation that they need to keep pushing through. And so this is a great space we're in to continue to have these conversations surrounding individuals in the criminal justice system and coming home justice housing, because if you don't get 2 or 1 night of good sleep, let alone 2, you ain't gonna be the same. You're not even gonna be able to think and function the same the next day. I promise you that. And it's gonna take us coming into these spaces and having these conversations. I'm not gonna take up too much more of the time. Please keep these stories in mind when you are going about your day and continuing the good fight that we're doing. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for that truth, Carolyn. I really appreciate that. It was really hard. I mean, it really touched my heart because, as you mentioned, being involved with this work, it's a personal thing. So I really appreciate that. Now we're going to move to our question and answer session. Our first question that we have, I will present to Keisha, and it is, does a criminal record prevent one from qualifying for housing assistance like Section 8 or public housing?
Okay, I will answer this the best way that I can. So for public housing, there are certain mandatory bans that are in place. So if somebody has So basically they're required to reject an applicant who has a household member. So this could be of somebody that is planning to live with them, who has been convicted of manufacture or production of methamphetamine on the premises of federally assisted housing. So if somebody's was cooking some meth in federal housing, that person must be rejected. If somebody has to be registered for life under a state sex offender program, that person must be rejected. And then if somebody has been evicted from federally assisted housing for drug-related criminal activity in the last 3 years, they must be rejected unless they have successfully completed a rehab program or circumstances have changed. However, I do want to note that one of the challenges that people have expressed is that sometimes local housing authorities may go even broader than those mandatory bans. And so they may be rejecting folks for other reasons that are on their criminal record beyond what is required. And so that has even more of a limit on who can be housed in those places. And it's also a problem.
Thank you for that. Dawn or Karen, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
No, I think we just got it perfectly. That that it's not, but I think the most important thing I want to reiterate is it's not just the person whose name is on the application, right? It's anybody in the household. And because we so many Black and brown folks live in multi-generational houses and have multi-generations in one, housing setting, it just makes it even harder for and more frequent for these types of collateral consequences to impact the whole family. So when we talk about these collateral consequences of being justice involved, it's important that we understand that those consequences are not limited to the person who is actually justice involved. Those consequences reverberate throughout the community and throughout those families, even if the other folks have not been justice involved.
Thank you for that. We'll move to the next question, and Dawn, I will present this one to you. Are there policies or changes that can be made at the municipal level that can help remove barriers for formerly incarcerated people to find housing?
And why do you know you're wrong for giving me this question? Absolutely. We can, in every municipality, it is the responsibility of elected officials, both city elected officials, municipal elected officials, county elected officials, state elected officials for that matter, to make sure that we have housing that is affordable, and not just affordable, but also low income housing, because there is a big gap between affordable and what a person on a minimum wage, low income scale can afford, right? And what the government calls low income, so many of our folks, especially municipally elected officials, are carving out spaces for people who are not just low income, but also for people who are living well below the poverty line, who are the working poor. Okay, we need to make sure that they are prioritizing ways, carving out spaces for those folks to find housing and to be able to live comfortably and without the fear of being evicted, without the fear of being priced out of their homes. Secondly, I think we need to have a real conversation about bond reform and reallocating funds away from police departments. In Raleigh, for example, somewhere in the neighborhood of 20% or more of the city budget is allocated towards law enforcement and public safety. What we would like to see is that money moved away from those from policing and put into and reinvested in the people. What does that look like? That looks like making sure that everybody that works for your city makes a living wage, and we raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. It means, like I've already discussed, making sure that there are places for people to live where they can afford and where they don't have to live in fear of being thrown out. We need to change some of these, some of the barriers for federally funded assisted living that relate to having a criminal conviction can't really be managed on a local level, but there are lots of other ways that we can supplement and work around that to make sure that folks coming out of prison, folks who have criminal records, whether they've been in prison or not, as Kerwin mentioned, have resources available to help them find and be placed into housing that they can afford and that they can be stable in. Because these are things that are local. All politics are local. And when you have a locally elected officials who are committed to ensuring that all citizens that elected them and that they represent have the basic human needs, that means food, clothing, shelter, and money to pay for those things, then we all rise. So the question of whether or not what can municipalities do to help facilitate these processes is the wrong question. The right question is, what is it that they can't do? Because they can do so much that what they can't do is the places that we should be concerned about meeting those gaps. But the problem is most of these municipalities are doing just about nothing to meet this need. And because they're doing nothing to meet this need, the gap is just unbelievable. And furthermore, as we see these eviction moratoriums lifted that have been in place because of COVID, we are going to see, you all, massive numbers of evictions, right? So the number of people who are going to have housing insecurities is going to be grossly exaggerated over the next year, over the next 6 months or so. That then is compounded by the issue of being just as involved. We are walking into a crisis of unimaginable proportions. And while we can wait for the federal government to do something about it, we really need to be holding our locally elected officials' feet to the fire, for them to be thinking forward and for them to be intentional about anticipating this problem that is coming, that is undeniable, and taking steps to make sure that they are protecting their citizens. I told you you shouldn't ask me.
Thank you for that, Dawn. Karen, is there anything you would like to add to that?
No, she pretty much hit it on the head.
Okay. Well, our last question is, well, no, there's another question. How long does the expungement process take, and how are you notified? Anyone that would like to answer that?
Okay, I can respond, although I think I saw Kerwin was maybe about to respond. But I will just say that it can really vary. So if you are dealing with only dismissed charges on your record, then you would just need to submit that particular petition into the clerk of court for whatever county you have. There are those dismissals, and just depending on what may the timeline that's happening in that county, it may take a shorter turnaround time, maybe a month or less, or it may take several months to get a response. It gets a lot more complicated if somebody has convictions on their record, because they may have to pay an associated filing fee. They may have to get an affidavit and do other steps kind of in order just to get the petition filed. In whichever county of conviction or counties of conviction. And then again, kind of it will depend on whether that person may have to end up setting up a date for a hearing and then whatever that timeline is after that. So could be a shorter timeline or longer timeline, kind of county dependent.
Karen, would you like to add to that as well?
No, just to reiterate what she said, that is extremely true. Depending on the whether these charges was dismissed or convictions, and depending on how the county really is responding. Some of these smaller counties, they take slower to respond. And I think that's kind of maybe due to lack of staff, or maybe due to just not handling the process of somebody trying to get their record expunged and different things of that nature. So it really varies. And also, as well as do individuals have a expungement clinic set up in this county? And so that's a whole nother story that could kind of help expedite the process if they do have it set up. But if they don't, man, it honestly is no telling. You could have a turnaround as quick as a month and a half, to be waiting almost a year and a half. Like, I didn't seen it range and really vary from place to place. But if anybody do have one in, keep fighting, keep calling, and keep pushing for it. As long as you keep it on their radar, then essentially what you'll end up doing is making them say, man, let me go ahead on it and do this paperwork so I can go ahead on it so they can leave me alone. And so sadly, that's what it takes sometimes, but you have to be in their ear like that.
Okay, thank you for that. We have 4 more minutes, and within those 4 minutes, as panelists, how, if someone would like to reach out to you, what is the best way? And also, if you would like to mention your email address and such, so that people can contact you. We'll start with you, Kerwin.
Okay, so my name is Kerwin Pittman, Kerwin Pittman, Pittman. I could be reached at KE Pittman, Pittman 0416 I can also be reached at www.rreps.net. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions, concerns, anything you may need some help with. Please feel free.
Thank you. Next, we will go to Keisha.
Yes, my name is Keisha Millett. I'm a staff attorney in the North Carolina Justice Center, so you can reach out directly to the Justice Center or to my email, which is quisha@ncjustice.org. Although you may get more questions answered if you reach out to Kerwin.
Thank you for that, Attorney Millett. And next, we will go to Attorney Blagrove.
I want to thank you all again for hosting this panel and this conference and having this very important and powerful discussion around housing. So often, justice-involved people are left out of these types of conversations, and it's refreshing to see them be included. You can reach out to me at Dawn, DAWN, at emancipatenc.org. You can find us at emancipatenc.org on you can visit our webpage there. You can also visit us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. Thank you so much for this opportunity again to elevate this important conversation.
Thank you all. I want to thank all of the panelists this morning. This was some very good information. Please reach out to them if you have further questions. Thank you all for participating. We are going to take a break before we introduce our next panel session, which will be with Colin Barber. We will take a 10-minute break. So if it is 10:15 by my clock, we will come back at 10:25, and Colin will be our presenter. Again, thank you all. Have a wonderful morning and be safe.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending the conference. We're going to start getting ready for our second panel today. But before that, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Colin Bober. I'm a member of the Fair Housing Hearing Board out here in Raleigh. And again, I'd like to thank everyone for showing up. I'd also like to give a special thank you to the individuals that have helped make this conference happen. So folks like at the City of Raleigh, such as Demetrius Edwards, thank you so much for helping us out here, as well as the folks over at NC Legal Aid and the Fair Housing Project. So thank you guys so much for making this happen and supporting us with getting all this set up. So similar to the first session, we're going to have a Q&A session here after the panel speaks. It'll be the same format, so we'll have our three panelists discuss information around emerging fair housing information around disabilities. Additional protections are constantly added to the Fair Housing Hearing Act, disability being one of those specific instances that was added in 1988, so after the initial passing of the Fair Housing Act. And we've brought in a panel to discuss just that, emerging issues and new information that we are hoping is going to help us out with getting closer to a more equitable housing environment. So our first panelist is Wanda Allen Abram. So Wanda Allen Abram is the Human Relations Director for the City of Winston-Salem. She began serving in this role in 2001. Ms. Allen Abram is originally from Fayetteville, North Carolina. And she's the first female to head the Human Relations Department and was one of the youngest department heads hired in Winston-Salem City Government. Before joining City Government, Ms. Allen Abram served as the Equal Employment Opportunity Coordinator in the Human Relations Division of the NC Department of Health and Human Services. Before serving with the state government, she worked as a legal compliance specialist in the Human Resources Division of Elk Grove Unified School District in Elk Grove, California. Under her leadership, the Winston-Salem Human Relations Department has received the 2016 National League of Cities Cultural Diversity Award for building integrated community pipeline program, and the 2018 University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill Institute for the Studies of America's Community Service Award for the department's diversity and inclusion work. Our second panelist will be Stephen M. Dane. Stephen M. Dane is a nationally recognized civil rights lawyer, particularly in the areas of fair housing, fair lending, and insurance discrimination. Mr. Dane was lead counsel for the plaintiffs in the class action litigation of Toledo Fair Housing Center v. Nationwide Mutual Insurance Company, and was co-counsel for the plaintiffs in Home of Richmond v. Nationwide Mutual Insurance Company. Mr. Dane is the author of many articles and books and book chapters in the field of fair housing, most recently Fair Housing Policy under the Trump administration, from the Human Rights Magazine, volume 44, number 3, which was published out in December 2019. He is an honors graduate of the University of Notre Dame and received his law degree from the University of Toledo College of Law. He is a former law clerk to the Honorable Pierce Lively of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit. And in 1998, Mr. Dane was selected as one of 8 lawyers of the year by Ohio Lawyers Weekly, and is listed as the best lawyers in America in the field of civil rights. Mr. Dane is the co-editor of the Civil Rights Insider, a quarterly e-newsletter of the Federal Bar Association's Civil Rights Law section. Mr. Dane also served as the president of the Toledo Bar Association from 2010 to 2011. Finally, we have our last panelist, Cherie Gilchrist. Cherie Gilchrist is the managing attorney for the Legal Aid of North Carolina Lance Central Intake Unit, where she supervised over 50 staff working in Lance's helpline. The helpline is the main entry point for Lance clients and provides intake services for over 50,000 callers annually. Suri was the project director for Lance's Housing Opportunities and Prevention of Evictions, or the HOPE program, which is a community partnership with the NC Office of Resilience and Recovery. In this role, she provided end-to-end management of the processing of applications and distribution of over $7 million in rental and utility assistance to North Carolina families. Before becoming a managing attorney, Suri was a supervising attorney at CIU and a staff attorney in the Lance Wilson office, where she practiced foreclosure defense and loss mitigation, landlord-tenant law, employment law, and general consumer law. Suri earned a Bachelor's of Science in International Relations and a Bachelor of Law from the University of West Indies, Jamaica in 1998 and 2001, respectively, and an LLM from Duke University School of Law in 2004. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our first panelists to start discussing. Wanda, whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you, Colin. I appreciate the introduction, and I'm really excited to be here today. I am coming at this topic in a unique way in that I am going to be talking about it from the vantage point of a FAP, or as a Fair Housing Assistance Program. And basically, as a FAP, we are a HUD partner. We are responsible for enforcing fair housing law here within the city limits of Winston-Salem, because our Fair Housing Code is substantially equivalent to the Fair Housing Act. And so as such, we do bear that responsibility. And so, like I said, I know that my peers on this panel will probably be getting more into the nuts and bolts of the actual law itself, but I definitely wanted to make sure that I kind of set the stage and managed a few expectations as far as how I will be approaching the subject matter today. So my name again is Wanda Allen Abraha, and I have been in this role now for approximately 20 years, and we have seen quite a bit of changes in terms of the types of cases that we receive in our office. And of course, disability cases have always been one of the top types of cases that we receive in the Winston-Salem office. So I'm going to now go ahead and share my screen. At least I'm going to attempt to do so. And while I'm trying to get that going, I don't know if you guys can see my screen or not, but as I attempt to, no, okay, I see someone shaking their head, no. How about now? Okay, awesome. Okay, awesome. What I wanted to do is, like I said, just kind of go into what we look for as a Fair Housing Assistance Program agency. And in terms of being a FAP, or a Fair Housing Assistance Program, we have a unique vantage point in that we actually get to try to understand the perspective of how a tenant is viewing his or her need for an assistance animal, and also the landlord or property manager's perspective in terms of whether or not they believe they should be required to acquiesce to a reasonable accommodation request. So of course, under the Fair Housing Act, an assistance animal is also called an emotional support animal, could be called just various things that pertain to emotional support or service. And so really, we try to help landlords and tenants to differentiate between the two. It's really surprising that a lot of landlords who are in this business really do not understand the difference, and they really, a lot of them don't frankly care to understand the difference. And so we feel that our role is not only as an enforcement authority, but also as one of an educator. We want to make sure that we help them to understand exactly what they should and should not be doing, and we want them to understand the basis as it is rooted in fair housing law. So of course, as we're talking about service animals, we're talking about animals that provide a specific service to the tenant. And so, for instance, the most common example that most people can relate to would be someone who is visually impaired and they may need what is called a seeing eye dog and so forth. And of course, emotional support may not necessarily mean that that is an animal that is providing that type of support, but it could be something else that the tenant needs on an emotional level that the animal provides to him or her. And so again, we try to explain these things in the simplest way so that landlords and tenants can kind of understand the baseline of what they are dealing with. And so, of course, with the Fair Housing Act, we are talking about properties that would fall under the auspices of the Act, including all types of dwellings, private housing, subsidized group homes, assisted living facilities, and most shelters and transitional housing. And of course, that sometimes can get a little gray when you're talking about short-term housing, such as hotels and motels. We did have that to come up not very long ago when we were talking about people who were living, they were using hotel rooms as actual places of residency. And so, of course, it came up as, okay, what protections do we have under the Fair Housing Act? And regardless, those types of facilities, hotels and motels, do have to allow service animals. And so anyway, that's something that is definitely one of the things that we have to always be cognizant of when we're talking to tenants is where are you residing? What is the nature of your residency? And so obviously, when we're asking the questions about what housing providers should consider, we are asking, does the person seeking to use and live with this animal have a disability? And so that is the big thing that we try to help tenants to understand, is that a disability is absolutely something that has to exist. It cannot be something that might exist. It can't be something that they suspect exists. We need to know, and they need to be able to show, demonstrate, and prove within all legal requirements, of course, not exceeding those, that they do have a substantiated disability. And of course, that is going to necessitate and dictate what the next steps will be in terms of which way do they need to go as far as providing documentation and so forth. And just as we're talking about this particular point, what we see when we're dealing with a lot of our fair housing cases is that sometimes tenants expect that any type of medical provider should suffice when it comes to establishing that nexus between their disability and the actual need for some type of assistance animal, whether it's a service animal or emotional support animal. And of course, we do explain to them that the nexus needs to exist and the landlord cannot go overboard with requiring documentation and with requiring that they prove somehow what the animal can do and demonstrate it and so forth. You know, they cannot go overboard, but the nexus itself needs to exist. And the reason I emphasize that is not too long ago, it came to our attention in our department, our investigators, our fair housing investigators were dealing with things such as people wanting to get letters from their medical providers that really weren't medical providers on a consistent and regular basis, even to the extent where some people thought it was okay to pay a fee online to be able to use a service that would just issue a letter to them asserting that they have a disability and that they would be able to use that same letter to present to a landlord to justify their reasonable accommodation request. And of course, that is not something that is advisable. It is not something that is legitimate, and is something that really tenants need to be mindful of, that they need to be working with hopefully a primary care physician or someone similar who is qualified to testify or to legitimate the fact that they do have a disability in the area of medicine in which they practice. And that has been something that we found very interesting And I know that it's been discussed at some of our HUD conferences and so on. But anyway, that's just one of the examples of how people can fall victim unknowingly and unwittingly to some of these online supposed providers of documentation for reasonable accommodation requests. So that's something that I just wanted to bring up as one of the unique challenges that we face as a FAP. So moving on, in talking about a reasonable accommodation request, we gave a couple of examples here on the slide, referring to a request to live with an assistance animal at a property where a housing provider has a no pets policy, or a request to waive a pet deposit fee or other rule as to an assistance animal. And of course, when you're talking about reasonable accommodation requests and tenancies, you're wanting a waiver of policies, practices, or rules that will allow you to have this reasonable accommodation request granted by way of an assistance animal. So when we're talking about the no pets policy, of course, we all know that many housing providers do have no pet policies, or they say, well, if you have a pet, you have to pay a fee. And the important thing to know, of course, is that when you're talking about assistance animals, they are not considered pets. And so under most of the policies and rules that housing providers have, service animals or assistance animals should be excluded automatically. They should know this. But surprisingly, many landlords do not know this, or they purport not to know it. And so, of course, we need to make sure that tenants are educated as well as landlords to understand that there needs to be a reasonable accommodation request granted, or at the very least considered, when they receive the request based on assistance animals. And of course, the fees, same deal. There shouldn't be fees assessed to service animals because they are not deemed pets. Colin, I thought you had a question, but I see that you're just signaling to me. Okay, thank you very much. And so moving on, because I know that my time is limited, we could really get into a lot of the nuts and bolts here, but with the verification requirement, I touched on that a few minutes ago in terms of making sure that the verification is legitimate from a medical provider, someone hopefully who has been treating the tenant for whatever the disability is, but also making sure that the letter is in conformity to what the fair housing law requires. And so there doesn't have to be a whole lot of detail in the letter. Primarily, you're just talking about justifying or stating rather that there is a disability and that there is a need for an assistance animal. And it doesn't have to go into diagnosis and all of the other detailed information. A landlord is not legally allowed to ask for a specific diagnosis and lots of detailed information, medical records and so on. They are not allowed to do that. And so really the verification is pretty straightforward. Helpful information always is that the tenants need to know that if they have an emotional support animal or service animal that does any type of damage, especially if they're unique animals or whether they're unique or not, if they do any type of damage to the property, it is their responsibility to make sure that they are covering those damages. Emotional support animals typically are required to be household animals, whereas usually when you're talking about service animals, we're talking about dogs, miniature horses. Those are the service animals that people should be aware of that would be considered acceptable. But emotional support animals, of course, can be a little bit different. You're talking about somewhat of a broader category. Could be cats, dogs, rabbits, some of everything. But of course, still, there could be some requests for unique animals such as snakes or pit bulls. But even then, careful documentation has to be provided. There's a little bit more of a requirement to substantiate those unique animals, but it's not that they are completely barred. But you have to have adequate documentation. And again, whether they're unique or household pets or whatever, tenants still have to know that they will be responsible for any damage that the pets may cause, and they have to have reasonable control over those animals to make sure they're not posing a direct threat to others. So of course, if there are ever any issues or questions, any suspicions of fair housing law violations that tenants may have, or if landlords have issues as well, they can always contact our office just to pose any general inquiries, or if tenants want to file housing discrimination complaints, they can contact our office to schedule an appointment. And then of course, we will ask them to bring certain documentation, and they will have to fill out the requisite paperwork to make sure that we can attempt to investigate and or conciliate the issue. And so basically that is where we are. We work in cooperation with our city attorney's office in the event that we do find reasonable cause to believe that discrimination has occurred. And so that's pretty much it. I know that I barely scratched the surface, but just wanted to give you all this information through the lens of a Fair Housing Assistance Program, or FAP agency, here in Winston-Salem. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Director Alan Abra.
You're welcome.
Great. So our next panelist to go over information will be Steve Dane. Excellent. So our next panelist will be Steve Dane, Attorney Dane, whenever you're ready.
Yeah, thank you, Colin and Wanda. I'm not sure that, there we go. Okay, I can see myself. Thank you. Yeah, thank you both. My task today is to do somewhat of a deep dive into COVID-19 and the Fair Housing Act and what implications it's having on the Fair Housing Act. It's a deep dive into a shallow pool because COVID-19 is so new, and there's not a lot out there that intersects directly with the Fair Housing Act, but what there is, I'm going to try to cover in the next 15 minutes. So let me share my screen with a PowerPoint. There we go. Is that clear enough? Oh, I don't want that one. Let's see. How's that? There we go. So I'm just going to raise several key issues and tell you what's going on in the space here. Is having COVID-19 a disability? If you contract COVID-19, does that mean you have a disability? The jury is out on that. There's very little case law on it. I would think there's none at this point. At least I couldn't find any. There's not any court that has said that if you contract COVID-19, you have a disability. Well, why might that be true after hearing all of the horror stories about COVID-19? In order to have a disability under the Fair Housing Act or the ADA, you have to have a substantial impairment, physical or mental, of a major life activity. COVID-19 may or may not have such an impairment. Many of the effects of COVID-19, depending upon the individual, could be temporary, they could be minor, or they can be severe, depending upon the individual. As we've seen, people have been hospitalized, and we hear the count of deaths every single day on the news. So it is very person specific, but just contracting COVID-19, not feeling well, having to take it to your bed, to ride it out with simple flu symptoms is not going to make it a disability. In the disability space, ADA fair housing, a short-term illness is not considered a disability. If you get the flu, if you get pneumonia, that doesn't affect you in the long term, you are not going to be considered disabled under these laws. However, the long-term effects of COVID-19 are still fairly unknown. On the slide there, you'll see there are a couple of articles written, appearing recently in the news, NPR and New York Times, indicating there's increasing evidence of serious long-term effects of having COVID-19 that could, in fact, put one into disability status. It's an ongoing issue. We're not sure where that's going to go, but having COVID-19 doesn't automatically make you disabled, but it could. Now, those of you who have some training already in disability law, including the Fair Housing Act, know that it's not simply a violation if you have a disability, but if a landlord or housing provider regards you as having a disability and takes an adverse action or discriminates, that is also a violation of the law, even if what you have is actually not a disability. I won't go into the case law on that, but you can be found to be in violation of law if you think somebody has a disability, whether they have one or not, and you take adverse action. There is one case out there. It's not a fair housing case, it's an employment case. But in the Parker versus Senlar case, the employee was dismissed after having been exposed to COVID-19 through a friend or a family member. Now, that of course wasn't the reason the employer gave for the dismissal, but the employee claimed that was the basis for the dismissal. And the court said, well, just because you were exposed to COVID-19, that doesn't mean you can be regarded as having a disability. That's as far as that case went. Not highly significant, but it is touching a little bit into the fair housing arena on concepts that we're used to. So as Wanda mentioned earlier, medical inquiries into a prospective tenant or an existing tenant's physical condition is not allowed under the Fair Housing Act, at least beyond the extent necessary to establish the existence of a disability if it is not obvious. So anyone in the housing field that asks people, do you have COVID-19? Have you been exposed to COVID-19? Have you had it in the past? I'm not going to say that is for sure a violation of the act, but it certainly is getting up close to the line about what may or may not be permissible inquiries in this space, in the housing space. What is more applicable at this point are accommodation requests. As Wanda indicated, housing providers, those in the housing space, must make exceptions to their normal rules, policies, and procedures for people with disabilities if necessary for the tenant or the home buyer or whoever to use and enjoy the dwelling. Well, what about those people that in fact have long-term effects from having contracted COVID-19? Let's assume for the moment that they do reach the point where they would be considered disabled by under the law. Then and they start to make an accommodation request. Well, the housing provider must provide the accommodation. And this is becoming a hot issue. I've cited, there's two articles there, one at NBC News, one by the Chain Store Age, which is some sort of trade journal, I think, where these issues are now starting to come forward in the ADA space, and you can be sure that they're going to come forward in the housing space. In fact, there are a couple of accommodation cases already out there. In the Raleigh case, it was a nursing home resident who was disabled and she had disabilities. She qualified as a disabled person under the Fair Housing Act. She did not have COVID-19, but the nursing home made a decision to create a COVID-19 ward, if you would, an area designated for people who contracted COVID-19. That required her to move, and she did not like that. And she requested an accommodation basically to stay there in the COVID-19 area. Somewhat of a flip side or a mirrored image to accommodation in this space, but that's what the claim was. And the court held that it was not a violation of the law for the nursing home to accede to her request. In the Eastwood versus Willow Bend Lake Homeowners Association case, the individual there claimed that their disability was a compromised immune system itself. And they claimed that was sufficient to trigger them as being protected under the act as having a disability. The court said, no, that is not a disability yet, just having a compromised immune. To see coming up in the future. I'll have you know that these examples are ones that HUD itself, Department of Housing and Urban Development, is noting as something that they are watching out for and are going to be prepared to deal with. These are not just ones that I made up on my own, but some reasonable accommodation requests and accommodations might include accepting applications online in a web-based portal rather than face-to-face in person in an office. Providing virtual or self-guided tours of an apartment complex instead of face-to-face, person-to-person guidance for apartment seekers, for example. Indeed, some apartment providers, housing providers, are going to concierge services for maintenance and other services. That is that you don't go to the maintenance office or deal with maintenance people, but schedule things online so that they can come and deal with the issues while you are not present or while you're out of the office. An interesting concept is scheduling the use of common areas in order to avoid other people in the space at the same time, like laundry rooms. Requesting special access to elevators or making special rules for access to elevators so you're not sharing space with others. And for those people who are disabled and required help and aids, making special rules for their access. And finally, even though the topic here is disability specifically, there are other ramifications to the COVID-19 crisis. And the U.S. Department of Justice, the Deputy Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, has issued and posted some notices on their website. You should go there and read it. Some of the tangential issues that have arisen out of the COVID-19 pandemic are not just the disability and ADA compliance, but hate crimes and discrimination against the Asian and Asian Pacific communities. Education inequalities have been accentuated along racial lines because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And as we all know, people in prison have exceedingly high rates of contracting COVID-19. That is a civil rights issue that the Department of Justice is also investigating. That's my presentation. I'll turn it back over to you, Colin.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Attorney Dane. Great. And so thankfully we're ahead of schedule. So we'll move on to our final panelists and then we'll get ready for the Q&A. I do see that questions are coming in, so please continue to provide us with questions and we'll hopefully get to one of your questions. So without further ado, Suri Gilchrist, if you are ready to step up, then we're super excited to hear what you have to say.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. Let me share my screen. So my session is going to be slightly different than the others because I was asked to talk a little bit about evictions, the state of evictions and the available rent assistance, in the state and coming down from the federal level. So evictions nationwide. According to the Census Bureau's Household Pulse survey that was administered between December 9th and 21st of 2020, more than 10 million renters responded that they were behind on their rent payments or at risk of being evicted within the next 2 months. When you compare that number, 10 million renters, to the 7 million families that lost their homes in the 4 years of the financial crisis that we had back in 2008, you can see the magnitude of the situation that we were all facing in 2020 as it relates to housing insecurity and evictions. North Carolina didn't fare much better. Prior to the pandemic, North Carolina was already one of the states that were identified as having some of the highest rates of evictions. A lot of our counties and cities were noted by the eviction lab as having some of the highest rates across the country in evictions. And in 2020, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities in North Carolina estimated that about 500,000 adults in rental housing were reporting that they were not caught up in rent, and that about 3 million adults reported difficulty in covering their household expenses. We also saw over 71,000 evictions filed between March 2020 and February 2021. Despite the eviction moratoriums, which I'll discuss in a bit, we didn't see much change in how evictions were being granted. Judges across the state continued to grant evictions. So who were most affected? Typically it's the most needy, the most vulnerable among our population, elderly, disabled, children with households with families, and minority households. Those are the groups that are typically most impacted by housing insecurity, and that played out through the pandemic as well. So it was against this backdrop that we had the moratoriums. And the first one that we had was the CARES Act moratorium that was signed into law on March 27th. However, this moratorium only applied to federally related properties. And what that means is that those were properties that were either backed by federal loans. So the landlord had a loan that was either Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, a VA, or a USDA loan, or they were participating in a federal assistance program. So they had a site-based Section 8 program or accepted housing choice vouchers. That accounted for only 28%, 28 to 46% of all the occupied rental units nationally. So it didn't cover the vast majority of evictions and rental properties nationwide. The CDC moratorium, which they framed as a public health, a response to a public health crisis, by issuing the order to temporarily halt residential evictions, it filled the gap that the CARES Act did not, because it applied universally to all rental properties and it applied nationwide. And so any landlord, owner, or person that had a legal right to pursue eviction were ordered not to evict somebody who was considered a covered person in one of these residential properties. And I'll, as I'll go into a little further, this order has been extended 3 times and is currently scheduled to end at the end of June 2021. So as I said before, the CDC order applies to all rental housing, but it does not cover individuals renting in hotels, motels, or other temporary guest home rentals. And, as I'll go into when I talk about rental assistance program, this is becoming an issue that we really need to start paying more attention to, because none of the assistance programs that we've seen cover utilities or rent for people that are currently in hotels or motels, even though we know that, a lot of the homelessness prevention programs and rehousing programs are using motels as a source of housing. And they're doing that for families that are most affected. Again, minority families, people that are disabled. And so the fact that it doesn't cover those groups put them at greater risk, or continue to put them at risk of evictions and homelessness. What's interesting about the CDC order, even though it covered more properties, it only covers evictions as they related to non-payment of rent, and not any of the other issues that landlords could evict for. So, if there's a breach of lease or criminal activity, the landlord could still evict. And what we found is that landlords would use this as a way to circumvent the CDC order. Instead of designating the eviction as a non-payment of rent issue, what they would do is designate it as the lease is expired or the tenancy is expired. And so they're not evicting for non-payment, even though that was the underlying reason for the eviction. So, the CDC still had its challenges where that was concerned. So a tenant could qualify for this protection if they could complete and give the landlord a signed declaration form attesting that they qualified. This initially proved to be very challenging. Again, at the helpline where I work, we saw our requests for assistance increase from about 300 to 500 calls to about 1,000 to 1,500 calls daily. The majority of those calls were for housing issues, eviction issues specifically. And a lot of it centered around the need for assistance with completing forms, because the families that we serve, unfortunately, they can't access the forms a lot of times. We have a huge population who are disabled, a huge client population who are disabled. They couldn't access the forms. They couldn't download them. They couldn't save them. They couldn't print them. There were all these issues regarding access to just the form that they needed to provide. And initially the moratorium, the order, did not provide an affirmative means for the landlord to give the tenant the form before they pursued eviction. So a lot of effort went into trying to get the form into the hands of people who needed it. The CDC, they said they didn't need to use a specific declaration form. They could use any written document as long as it had the same requirements that were contained in the declaration. But again, it was more of an access issue for the families that we encountered, or the clients that we encountered at Legal Aid. So in addition to the federal moratoriums, we also had Governor Cooper, who executed several executive orders. Starting with Executive Order 171, it was adopted as a way to fill some of the gaps that the CDC moratorium had and extend the relief to certain families, specifically those who were participating in the HOPE program. And his orders, he has done extensions as well, the latest one being Executive Order 206 that has extended it through to June 30th. So the rental assistance programs, we know that we have the HOPE program, Housing Opportunities and Prevention of Eviction program. This came out of the CARES Act. 117 million was set aside or earmarked for rent and utility assistance. As was mentioned, Legal Aid was a community partner in this endeavor. And we received over 14,000 applications. We were initially expecting about 8,000, received 14,000, and helped to disperse about almost $8 million in funding. The HOPE program, again, initially had a lot of documentation requirements that made it difficult for families that were disabled and renters who were disabled to access the necessary forms and to provide the necessary forms. So it resulted in a lot of delays. The program has reported, though, that it has paid out over $108 million to landlords and utility providers across the state. In January of this year, we saw the launch of the emergency rental assistance programs that are funds that were established through the Consolidated Appropriations Act. It's being administered through the Department of Treasury. And what was important about this was that these funds were specifically set aside and said to target the most vulnerable. So people who could not take advantage of previous rent assistance programs, it was said that this program should be specifically targeted to them. So language access issue, people who had language access issues, families who were disabled and had other access issues should get priority with accessing these funds. Governor Cooper announced that over $500 million of this is going to be earmarked for the HOPE program. It's separate from the CARES funds that they're still doling out, but it's earmarked for them. And the counties have also received EARP funding to bolster their rental assistance programs as well. The American Rescue Plan is the final rental assistance program that was just signed into law. It allocated $30 billion for rental assistance. And again, these funds are being administered by the Department of Treasury, so it will likely bolster the existing ERAPs that are currently available. And I imagine, again, that the focus would be on families who are most vulnerable. So that's it. I think I got in right under time. Here's our contact information. If you'd like further assistance or you'd like to reach out to Legal Aid, or numbers right there, it's 866-219-5262. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Managing Attorney Gilchrist. So at this point, we're ready for Q&A, and we've already had a few questions come in. I'm going to take a set of 2 questions and kind of consolidate them into one. So the first one was if a tenant, commits a potentially violent act against someone, a threat of violence, can that person be evicted during the moratorium? And I'd like to roll that into something that we were just discussing, which is our criminal records. And in the numbers that Attorney Gilchrist just quoted, are we seeing individuals with criminal records being segregated from those statistics of eviction numbers? So do we have information on underlying eviction numbers, what demographics do they fall into, and 2, how do moratoriums work with criminal history backing? So if anyone would like to take that.
So if the question is, has the moratorium segregated people who are, who have criminal records? I have not seen that at Legal Aid. It has so far been used to provide protection to everyone. However, you know, again, the moratorium, specifically the CDC's protection, only applies to non-payment of rent issues. So, you know, it's conceivable that a landlord could use somebody's criminal history or their record as a means of getting that person out of the rental home, as opposed to using the protection that would keep them there. They could use that as the basis for eviction. They could, you know, identify some sort of criminal frame it as a criminal activity argument to try to get that person out. But in general, I haven't seen that.
Okay, well, thank you. This one's more relevant towards Attorney Dane. So what happens when someone contracts COVID, say while working at a shelter or just another part of their job, and now they're on oxygen for the rest of their life due to the contraction of COVID? You know, some complication that comes after the fact due to the environment in which they had to work in.
Yeah, that's a good question, and that highlights the point that COVID-19, even having it, doesn't itself make you disabled. The long-term consequence, such as having to live on oxygen for the rest of your life, that person is disabled. I mean, that affects a major life activity, breathing, probably walking, other means of physical exertion. At that point, the person has become disabled under the Fair Housing Act and the ADA, and therefore, you know, would be protected to the full extent under those laws. That's a consequence of having COVID-19 for that individual, and that definitely would be a situation where the contraction of the COVID-19 has migrated into a person having a disability because of the effects of it.
Great. Thank you. This one is for Director Alan Abra. So would it be wise for there to be something included in a lease for an individual, you know, a tenant that has a disability that outlines their disability rights, and this needs to be engaged by the landlord as well as the tenant and recognized as part of that written contract? Or is that something that's, you know, already codified within the law itself?
Well, I think I'm understanding the question to be, should disability rights be outlined in the contract as a part of the lease agreement? Okay.
Yes.
And so I don't think that would necessarily be a bad idea. I think it's really good for landlords to take affirmative steps to ensure that tenants are educated about those protections. However, I know of nothing that would require them, of course, to do so. But also, whenever there is a question about whether or not there are certain steps that the landlord is expecting a tenant to take in terms of who to contact and so forth, we always advise landlords to post that information at the very least in the leasing office or in common areas, so that tenants know where to go if they do have reasonable accommodation requests or anything of that sort. We found that has served landlords very well because oftentimes, well, at least in one particular case that ended up being conciliated in our office, the landlord was trying to forego even entertaining a reasonable accommodation request because the tenant did not follow the specific steps and did not use the specific form on which the landlord wanted such requests to be submitted. And of course, we know that that is not allowed. That is a violation. So anyway, it probably would not hurt to have that information spelled out in as many places as possible, including potentially along with paperwork for the lease agreement.
Interesting. Well, thank you. This is
You're
one that we can have the whole panel hopefully chime in on. The original question is if a person is in a wheelchair temporarily due to a surgery, for example, would they be considered disabled under the Fair Housing Act? And to expand upon that, temporary disability, if one is evicted or unable to actually utilize the facilities that they were able to previously, but now due to a temporary disability, how does that all play out?
Well, I'll start with taking a stab at that. It depends on the facts and circumstances. There is nothing in the Fair Housing Act that limits or addresses the duration of a disability, or when a disability starts or when a disability ends. And it is possible for a disability to arise after a tenant becomes a tenant. It is possibility. There is also the possibility that a tenant with a disability becomes non-disabled over the course of time. Depends upon what the disability is. Oftentimes in the fair housing situations, fair housing claims anyway, for short-term disabilities, the issues don't last long enough for there to be violations of law. The possible exception to that, or typical example of that, is the one you asked about, which is parking. It is a requirement for people with ambulatory disabilities to request a reserved parking space or a handicapped parking space nearer to their unit than the one that is out there for the general population, or to request one that is specific and reserved for them. And under the law, depending upon the circumstances, the housing provider would in fact probably have to make an exception to their rules and permit that tenant to do it. Whether that would have to be done for a week or so, after someone goes through surgery, I don't really have a clear answer to that I can give you yes or no under all circumstances. If someone, however, is in a wheelchair and it's obvious that they're going to be in that position and cannot walk on their own for, let's say, 6 months, then I think a housing provider probably have an obligation upon request to make an exception to their, if it's first come, first served parking, and would have to provide a handicap parking space. That's my view.
And I would just add to that, I totally agree, Attorney Dane, with everything that you said, and at least through the lens of a FAP agency, what we would be also wanting to make sure of is that the landlord is not pressing the tenant to disclose any type of diagnostic information that they are not allowed to ask. And of course, they can't go but so deep, they can't delve but so deeply. So that would be the only thing that I would add, is that we would just caution the landlord not to dive too deeply into the diagnosis and prognosis and so forth.
And at least to follow up on that specific point. So again, let's say that this is known by the individual as temporary. When they convey that to the landlord, they shouldn't have to do that. It's no different than an individual, than this being a permanent, part of their life going forward. So any accommodations that are offered by the landlord for an individual that is disabled for a longer term would be offered to the temporary individuals. Handicap parking within reason, all paid for by the landlord. Is that all correct?
Yes, I'm not sure if that was posed to me or Attorney Dane, but yes.
Yep, I'm going to agree with that for sure.
Okay, great, thank you. Be available and available to, being able to be distributed to the community. That's around what time with that?
So the current round of Hope funding is still ongoing. It's still being dispersed, and it will continue to be dispersed until they have completed the number of applicants that they still have pending. So they still have a few people that, well, I shouldn't say a few, they still have a number of people that they're still dispersing payments to. The second round of funding, I don't know if it will be called the Hope program, to be honest. Again, it's money coming from the Department of Treasury as part of the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. And it's going to be a lot different than the current Hope program that's in place. It, for example, they are not going to be, it's going to be administered by the Office of Recovery and Resilience, again, NCORE, but it's not going to be they're not going to do it statewide. They have entered into agreements with counties, and counties will run their own rent assistance programs using ARAP funds as well. So, and I think, the legislature has also imposed some changes that NCORE will have to implement. They have to, for example, set up a call center to handle and address complaints and concerns about access issues that they were having, how long the process has taken, the documentation that's required. A lot of that they're revising or have revised. They're having to change the way they calculate rents. Calculating rents based on the amount the tenant actually pays, as opposed to the average rent per county that they had switched to. So there are lots of changes that they have to make before I think they start dispersing the funds that they were earmarked to distribute. But again, it's going to be a lot different than the current Hope program. So in a roundabout way, no, I don't have a specific timeline for when this new round of Hope funding will be dispersed.
Okay, well, we are at our original schedule's time. I'm not sure if we want to do one more question. I'll let the powers that be answer that, or if we should call it and transition on to our next event. One more? Okay, we can do one more question then. So this could be for anyone, but does kind of fall into Attorney Gilchrist's silo a little bit more. Can you clarify again the difference between the Hopes and Cares Act and how much, or the cash in which is being provided, the assistance for individuals?
So the actual amount that's being provided, is that what you're asking?
I guess for something more specific, CARES was something that was an emergency funds that were supposed to come out as soon as possible, get to the people as quickly as possible. At least, that's the idea. Hopes, you just described, at least with this round, that it's a little more slower, targeted, supposed to fix, ideally some longer term issues. So, kind of the urgency of the funds, what they're really looking to address and trying to work on, immediate, or is this something that's transitions us into a new normal when it comes to how the funding is distributed?
Just to clarify, the Hope program, or the Housing Opportunities and Prevention of Evictions program, it was funded through the CARES Act. So CARES is the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. And so HOPE is funded through that act, and $117 million was what was set aside for the current HOPE program to be distributed statewide for rent and utility assistance. This second round is funded through the Department of Treasury, and it's the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. So you know, there's not, when you say the difference between HOPE and CARES,
I think that gets to the heart of the question. I think that does help address it. So again, thank you everyone for one, watching this conference, as well as two, thank you to our panelists, Director Alan Abra, Attorney Dane, and Attorney Gilchrist. Thank you so much for your time and the information that you've shared with all of us. At this time, we're going to transition over to our awards section, and I'll hand it off to Sandra Collins.
Can you hear me? There I am. Now I'm live. Awesome sessions. But getting into our award ceremony, there are so many individuals and organizations that provide services to our communities that otherwise may not be addressed. So the Fair Housing Hearing Board and the Legal Aid of North Carolina, we both try to recognize some of those efforts. So I'm excited about the ones I get to recognize today on behalf of the Raleigh Fair Housing Hearing Board. So I read a quote recently, and I thought of this young lady. It reads, or it read, "Outstanding isn't something a person has, it's something a person does." And it fits her so well. So the Fair Housing Hearing Board had the honor and pleasure of working with this outstanding person. And she's on screen, Ms. Marquita Mbono. There are no adjectives to truly describe what you mean and what you meant and what you truly mean to each of us at the Fair Housing Board. Your spirit, your soul are beyond your years to be so young. Your vision and desire to help us and always having a positive impact on everything that you touch to help us when you work with us at the Fair Housing Board. You had our backs, you kept us on our toes, and you always made sure our I's were dotted and our T's were crossed. And most importantly, no one ever crossed us. You protected us like you were part of our board and like you didn't even work for the city. And we love you for that. Marquita, always remember you have a God-given talent and that you're special inside and you are special outside. And you're capable of excellence and you are excellent. You are destined for great things. And Wanda, Chalisa, Colin, and I wish you the best. We look forward to witnessing your journey to greatness. And don't forget us. It is our honor to present you with an award that I don't have in my hand in appreciation for outstanding and dedicated services to our community. We love and miss you, and you will always be a dear friend to us. Love you. We all love you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Oh, y'all about to make me emotional. I wasn't expecting that. So I did have a few remarks, and thank you so much, Sandra, for those kind words. This acknowledgement is very unexpected, and I'm truly humbled and honored by the kind words, and just to be able to go through this walk and this journey with you all. You are astounding people, and anyone who knows me knows that the Raleigh Fair Housing Hearing Board has a very special place in my heart, and you always will, and I mean that. The board, you all are made up of exceptional individuals who are passionate about fair housing and social justice, and you live and breathe this work, and you truly understand the importance of addressing and mitigating barriers to housing. So I love you all for that. And just really quickly, when I first began working with the board, I was somewhat unfamiliar with fair housing rights, the history and its importance and its impacts in our communities. And I quickly learned and realized there's so much work that needs to be done. And it immediately sparked a passion within me to do my part in this fight for justice in housing for all people. And as I was thinking about today's conference, I was reminded of a quote by the late Congressman John Lewis, who said, "My philosophy is very simple. When you see something that's not right, not fair, not just, say something, do something, get in trouble, good trouble, necessary trouble." So I encourage each of you, no matter who you are, where you are, your background, what field you're in, to have the courage to get into good and necessary trouble to advance fair housing rights across North Carolina, across the nation. Your loved ones, your community, and future generations are counting on you. So again, thank you all for this acknowledgement. I am truly grateful, and I really appreciate it. Love you, thank you.
Love you, love you, love you. Okay. So let me see if I can gather myself for the second award. Love you, Marquita. This gentleman, he loves the Lord and have a personal relationship with God. He's a student of the Word of God. Reverend Philip C. Brickell, Jr. was born in New Rochelle, New York, moved to North Carolina on a football scholarship at Johnson C. Smith University. He made a life-changing decision and received his associate degree in theology from the Raleigh Institute of Biblical Studies in Raleigh, North Carolina. He was ordained in 2001 by the Wake County Baptist Association. Reverend Brickell is the founder and president of Lost Sheep Outreach Ministry in Raleigh, North Carolina, and have developed a partnership and support system with churches, ministries, businesses, families, and friends. I think he has a really good relationship with everybody in Raleigh, North Carolina, and surrounding areas. He has a burning desire to meet the physical and spiritual needs of the community of forgotten persons. The organization serves the needs of the homeless and less fortunate by providing back to school celebrations, coats, clothes giveaway, women and men prayer breakfasts, health fairs, food fairs. He works with other worship services and do combined services, Thanksgiving dinners, Christmas celebration, and at Christmas, thousands and thousands of gifts to families and individuals for their children in our community. And on any given day, and I'm sure everyone on this call may have witnessed on the news, Pastor Brickell, you can find him downtown Raleigh, blessing the unfortunate with $20 bills. I think that's a good nickname for him. I'm gonna start calling you $20 bills. His favorite saying is, when you're down, you don't need nobody stepping on you. And his favorite scripture is, being confident of this very thing, that which have begun a good work in you will perform it until the day of Jesus Christ. Philippians 1:6. I am so pleased to recognize this well-deserved man of God, my friend, Reverend Brickell, with an award and appreciation for your outstanding and dedicated services to our community. We need many, 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 many more of Pastor Brickell's. Love you. Thank you.
Bless you, Sandra. I am so humbly grateful There are so many who are co-laborers who could be here at this time. And so I don't receive this just for myself, but I do receive it for all of my co-laborers. I am so grateful for the panel who selected me this year. I'm thankful for our partners, for our donors, for our volunteers. I've had an incredible experience being president and founder of Lost Sheep Outreach Ministry. This June, it'll be 25 years serving the community. And then I've also had an incredible, blessed time working at CASA for 17 years. It'll be in June. So just between those two organizations and partnering with so many different people, it has only flamed my passion to continue to go out and make a difference. I have a coworker who coined a phrase that we all use at CASA now, together we go. And I just believe together we can make a difference in our community. So I'm grateful, I'm humbled. I just thank God for the opportunity to give him the glory. 25 years ago in Moore Square, who thought that just taking 5 people in a pot of chili would turn into where we are now? So we give God the glory. We give all of you thanks. And if ever I'm needed, please give me a call and let me know. I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. And now we're going to turn it over to, I almost said the wrong person. We're going to turn it over to the legal aid department.
Great. This is George Housen. I'm the Executive Director of Legal Aid, and I'm honored to be the presenter for the 2021 Stella J. Adams Fair Housing Advocate Award. Let me start off by thanking the Fair Housing Hearing Board and the City of Raleigh for sponsoring the conference. It's always one of the big events in our Fair Housing Project, and I want to acknowledge our Fair Housing Project. Legal Aid of North Carolina is a statewide nonprofit law firm, and the Fair Housing Project is one of our prominent and important projects dealing with housing discrimination all across the state. And Jeff Dillman and Jack Holzman do an extraordinary job, along with Kelly Clark and Lauren Brazell and the rest of the team. They really do an extraordinary job. And we're very proud of the work that they do and the partnership that they have with the Fair Housing Hearing Board. I thought I knew something about fair housing when I came here 20 years ago. I've litigated fair housing. I've run a fair housing project, but I ran into Stella Adams when I got here, and her obvious knowledge of the law, her organizing skill, her indefatigable spirit and passion and commitment, and her long service disabused me of my own little conceit about my knowledge. With Stella, the word icon is just inadequate. It doesn't go far enough. And so to receive an award in her name signals extraordinary achievement, and Legal Aid receives this honor, or reserves this honor, only for the extraordinary advocates or organizations with outstanding accomplishments in the area of fair housing. So I am very proud to announce that the 2021 Stella Adams Award is being given to Disability Rights of North Carolina. Disability Rights is a nonprofit legal advocacy agency that fights for the rights of people with disabilities in North Carolina in cases involving discrimination, abuse, and other rights violations. Its advocacy is based on important values, including that people with disabilities have the right to be heard and a right to live independently in the world, increasing the power of people with disabilities through advocacy and the relentless pursuit of justice. One of the other principles there in advocacy and values is full inclusion and self-determination for people with disabilities. Among their important successes was a challenge to North Carolina's past segregation of persons with mental disabilities in institutions. And just this past month, the settlement of a lawsuit brought with the NAACP, the ACLU, and several individuals challenging the state's treatment of prisoners during the COVID pandemic, which will result in early release for 3,500 people. Throughout their work, DRNC has continued to be an important advocate for the housing rights of persons with disabilities. Legal Aid of North Carolina is honored to award them the Stella J. Adams Fair Housing Advocate Award today. And the text of the award, in recognition of its long-standing commitment to the fair housing and civil rights of all North Carolinians, the Fair Housing Project of Legal Aid of North Carolina hereby presents the 2021 Stella J. Adams Fair Housing Advocate Award to Disability Rights North Carolina this April 23rd, 2020. And Lisa Nesbitt, supervising attorney at DRNC, is accepting the award. So I'm going to turn it over to Lisa for any comments there. And I think she's going to flash that magnificent award to you so you all get a view of it.
Thank you, George. I appreciate that. I'm going to see if you can see it. It is a lovely award. It's really, really well done. I thought it would look nice on the wall at Disability Rights. I thank Legal Aid on behalf of everyone at DRNC. In case anybody doesn't know who Disability Rights is, we are the protection and advocacy organization designated by the federal government for the state of North Carolina. Our services are free. There's a group like us in every state in the country, and we don't have any income limitations in providing services. We work in employment, education, jails and prisons, community access to buildings, Medicaid services. If there's a disability connection to it, we probably can answer questions or help or provide help. It is pretty humbling to receive this award because the namesake of the award has such a long commitment to civil rights and in the housing context. I want to say when we get a housing case, it's truly a collective effort at Disability Rights because we try to serve the whole person. And if they come with other issues, you know, they need Medicaid services, they have education issues, we try to help them in those areas and even point them to employment opportunities if we can do that. Because as you all know, without those things, housing often fails and they can become homeless. So we try to look at the whole picture. I want to give a shout out to Legal Aid. They have so much more experience in this than we do. We've been ramping up our housing for about the last 2 years. They have been very gracious in allowing us to bounce ideas off of them and pick their brains. They have been generous in providing both me and my colleague Elizabeth Meyerholtz with resources. And so I can't thank Legal Aid enough for their help. And again, I just want to say thank you on behalf of everyone at Disability Rights that works in the trenches every day, because it is a group effort, and it's not just DRNC, it's all of you as well. So thank you very much.
Well, great job, Lisa. Thank you. And I think we're going to turn it back over to Chalisa Williams, who's got one more award for us, and then we will take a break after that for 10 minutes. Chalisa?
Yes, thank you. How's everybody doing? Everybody's good? Everybody's enjoying the conference so far? I am. So this next award goes to an organization. I have not experienced their graciousness personally. However, I do feel like I have a unique connection as we've had guests actually visit the Fair Housing Hearing Board and talk about this organization. I managed a low-income property where residents received their whole houses furnished by this organization, as well as my daughter, who's a student at Raleigh Charter. She goes and volunteers at this organization. With large amounts of Wake County households living below the federal poverty line who cannot afford essential household needs like furnishings for their homes or beds for their children, we have the Green Chair Project here changing lives. I would like to say thank you to Jackie Craig and Beth Smoot for your vision. For small fee clients working with case managers from over 90 partner agencies, they can select linens, cookware, accessories, furniture, beds, whatever is needed to furnish their homes from the Green Chair Project. The Green Chair Project promotes the idea of choice and empowers clients to begin to rebuild. I like to emphasize the word choice. As we're here today on the Fair Housing Call, we understand that housing is a choice, is a right. But the fact that this organization allows choice, you can come in their facility and pick the furniture that you think and you know that look good, the furniture that you want, the furniture that you choose, the things that you choose. No matter of where they're coming from, homelessness, shelters, single mothers maybe leaving bad relationships. They are part of this organization and they are able to choose their own furniture to rebuild, which is powerful to me. So we would like to extend the award to the Green Chair Project on behalf of the City of Raleigh Fair Housing Hearing Board. We want to thank you for your dedication, your commitment into the fact that you have your recipients choose, and not only that, you treat them like people. They feel human. They don't look at their environment or the circumstances in which they're coming to your organization. They're leaving your organization with their things feeling new. So thank you to Jackie Craig for joining us today, for your vision, your continued service, and also everything you do for the community. And I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Chalisa. It is our privilege and honor to be here with amongst you all today. The Green Chair has furnished over 1,000 households every year. And we also provide beds for children and furnishings for families who would otherwise be without. And many of you know, we don't just give out furniture, but we provide it with dignity and help furnish each and every home in that way with the choice, as you mentioned. We believe that everyone deserves a well-equipped home, and having those essential tools will help folks live a healthy and comfortable life, and that is what will nurture and sustain them in their housing. We couldn't do what we do without the support of over 90 plus agency partners like so many of you on this call today. We are honored to support your goal of this organization and this conference of being able to ensure fair housing and equitable housing for everyone. Thank you so much for recognizing this work that the Green Chair is doing for this community. It is really recognizing the efforts of the whole community, from those that donate the furniture to those that volunteer to you agencies that identify the recipients. It is just our privilege to serve and host this project for Wake County.
That's great. Thank you, Chalisa, for that. I guess I can turn it over to Sandra. We were supposed to start to introduce the keynote speaker at noon, but we were supposed to also have a 10-minute break. So Sandra, I think it's your call as to when we start.
Well, we've done so well. If I would like to move forward with a 10-minute break, and then we'll pick up after that.
Excellent. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back. I'm George Housen with Legal Aid of North Carolina. It's my honor and privilege this afternoon to introduce Lisa Rice, with the National Fair Housing Alliance. Let me just say personally that Legal Aid of North Carolina is a longstanding member of the National Fair Housing Alliance. And even more personally, I have to say that any organization that employs Cheryl Frost Brown is top-notch in anyone's book. So Lisa Rice is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the National Fair Housing Alliance, an association with over 200 member organizations across the country that work to eliminate barriers in the housing markets and expand equal housing and lending opportunities. They really are the seminal and starting agency for everything that is wonderful about the fair housing work that happens all across the country. NFHA provides a range of programs to affirmatively further fair housing, including community development, neighborhood stabilization, training, education, outreach, advocacy, consulting, and enforcement issues, enforcement initiatives. They're the whole gamut. They're the driving force for everything across the country. Their programs have resulted in the expansion of equal housing opportunities for millions of people throughout the United States. In addition to leading the National Fair Housing Alliance, Ms. Rice is a member of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights Board of Directors, the Center for Responsible Lending Board of Directors, the JP Morgan Chase Consumer Advocacy Council, the Mortgage Bankers Association's Consumer Advisory Council, the Freddie Mac Affordable Housing Advisory Council, the Urban Institute's Mortgage Servicing Collaborative, and the Quicket Loans Advising Committee. It's a great honor and a coup for the Fair Housing Hearing Board in this conference to have Lisa Rice, and we're welcome and privileged to have her. Lisa.
George, thank you so much for that really warm invitation. And I want to thank the Legal Aid Society of North Carolina for inviting me to participate in your national conference. I'm really honored to be here. And I have to note, you sang the praises of Cheryl Frost Brown, who is our Vice President of Membership Services. And you're absolutely right. She is a jewel. And I have to too sing the praises of Jeff Dillman. I first started working with Jeff when I was situated in Toledo, Ohio, and Jeff was working for a fair housing group in Cleveland, Ohio. That's when I first met with him. And so I've been working with and collaborating with Jeff on fair housing issues for many years. I won't say how many, but many years. And we're so honored and privileged to have the Legal Aid Society as a member of the National Fair Housing Alliance. We really are blessed to have you as members and working in colleague with us on advancing fair housing issues here in North Carolina. I'm in Washington, D.C., and this is the land. This is the land of the Piscataway, Kone, and the Algonquin Native tribes. I must give homage to those original caretakers of this land and this space that I now occupy. I just wanted to share a couple of thoughts with you about fair housing issues, sort of emerging trends that we're seeing on the landscape, and talk to you about some new things that are coming on the horizon. So I'll do that for maybe about 30 minutes. And I'm not sure if we can open it up to Q&A, but I'm happy to do that if that is the wishes of the conference organizers. So what I'm going to do is attempt here to share my screen. Let's see if this works. See if I can get this technology going right. And let's see what happens here.
Looks great.
Okay, and you guys are able to see the screen? All right, perfect. So unfortunately, we still have a very high levels of housing discrimination in the United States. There are over 4 million instances of discrimination that happen each year. The lion's share of those fair housing complaints, those fair housing discrimination incidents, however, do not go reported. Only about 30,000 fair housing cases get reported each year. And much of that is because people who experience discrimination actually don't know that they have been discriminated against. Oftentimes discrimination happens under cloak and veil, and it is hard to detect the signs of discrimination because, again, discrimination can happen with a handshake and a smile. And so people just really aren't attuned to it. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later in the presentation. The majority, though, of those 30,000 complaints that do get reported get handled by private fair housing organizations and private groups like the Legal Aid Society of North Carolina. So over 70% of housing discrimination cases get handled by private organizations as opposed to the federal government. And I have to comment on the fact that unfortunately, even though we have had the Fair Housing Act in place for over 50 years, and the Fair Housing Act is in part designed to address the scourge of residential segregation, still, unfortunately, too many of our communities are very segregated, in some cases hyper segregated. Our neighborhoods and communities are more segregated today than they were 100 years ago. And that is driving a lot of the inequalities that we see in the nation. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later in the presentation. Did want to flag that each year the National Fair Housing Alliance produces a report on fair housing trends in America. We're going to be producing the report for 2021 in just a couple of months. So I wanted to flag that for you so that it can be on your radar. Please be on the lookout for that trends report when it comes out. We are coming, entering this new presidential administration, coming off the heels of really unprecedented attacks on fair housing. I've been doing fair housing work for 40 years, and I have never seen the level of attacks on fair housing, on equal housing opportunity, like what we witnessed over the past 4 years. Really, there was a lot of vitriol, a lot of opposition to fair housing, and that was manifest in a number of ways. I won't go through all of the ways that it was manifest because really we'd be here all day and all night if I went through the litany of attacks that the previous administration launched against fair housing and equal opportunity for people. But I will lift up two major attacks. One related to what is called the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Rule, and the other related to a really important, critical civil rights tool known as disparate impact. But let me start with Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing, and I have to give pause here just to pay homage to Senator and former Vice President Walter Mondale, who was a co-author along with Ed Brooke of the Fair Housing Act. And Senators Brooke and Mondale were really brilliant in the way that they crafted the Fair Housing Act, because it has a dual purpose. On one side of the coin, eliminating incidents and actions, practices of housing discrimination against consumers and communities. But on the flip side, the inclusion of this, I'm going to call it an equity piece, called Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing, which recognizes the fact that that as a result of our federal laws, as a result of our state laws and policies, we created, as a society, we created residential segregation. We designed and orchestrated a segregated society. We created the society that not only has people segregated based on race and national origin, but a society that segregates opportunities, right? That's why we say where you live matters. Because this segregation that we see today is not a normal construct, right? It was put in place by policymakers and housing industry providers over the decades. And affirmatively furthering fair housing says we get to undo that designed residential segregation that separates so many communities away from the important amenities and services that they need, and reconnect those communities to critical services and opportunities. So the affirmatively furthering fair housing provision of the Fair Housing Act, extremely important, has never been enforced, not ever been enforced. And in 2015, for the first time, HUD crafted really strong rules around affirmatively furthering fair housing. The Trump administration undid all of that and replaced it with a new rule called Preserving Housing and Neighborhood Choice, which is a rule that is nothing about fair housing. It has nothing to do with fair housing. So we really, really did water down the enforcement mechanisms and the sort of the protocols that the Obama administration had put in place to finally enforce and implement the AFFH provision. The second item that I mentioned is the disparate impact rule. In September of last year, HUD implemented a new disparate impact standard that was really, really harmful. The National Fair Housing Alliance, along with a number of our members, sued the Department of Housing and Urban Development over the implementation of that new disparate impact standard that essentially removed the ability of victims of discrimination to use disparate impact under the Fair Housing Act. A judge granted a stay of implementation on that 2020 rule. And so what we just saw a couple of weeks ago, or last week, excuse me, is that the Biden administration sent new proposed rules to the Office of Management and Budget. And what we're thinking, what we believe is these new rules will be designed to undo the harms caused by the previous administration. So we expect to see the reinstatement of a really strong affirmatively furthering fair housing rule and a really strong disparate impact rule. One of the things that I want to note, particularly about disparate impact, which is the concept that says, if you have a policy or a rule that may seem neutral on its face, but the implementation of that policy or that rule has a discriminatory effect on protected classes under the Fair Housing Act, you have to abandon that discriminatory rule for a rule that has a less discriminatory impact if it is proven that that original rule really has no business justification, right? It's not really necessary for you to do that. So a great example of that, I'll give a story where we utilized disparate impact back when I was working in Toledo, Ohio, at the Toledo Fair Housing Center. We had a local CDC, a Community Development Corporation, that was building a new multifamily housing development. And they had a requirement that anyone living in the development had to be gainfully employed. So you had to have full-time employment in order to occupy one of the residential units. And so we went to the CDC, which is a nonprofit organization, right? They were trying to do the right thing. And we said to the CDC, we just want to point out that having this rule has a discriminatory effect, a disparate impact on people with disabilities. Tell us why you have this rule in place that folks have to be gainfully employed. And what they said was, well, we want to make sure that people can afford the housing payment. And so we responded and said, well, many people may not be gainfully employed, but they may have the requisite income needed to afford them the unit. So why don't you change that rule to just say that you got to be able to afford the unit so that you're not, by unintended consequences, discriminating against people with disabilities. So that's an example of disparate impact. Unfortunately, though, for the entire history of the Fair Housing Act, almost since we've been using disparate impact under the Fair Housing Act, and the first instance of that happened in 1974. So since that time until almost today, the housing industry has been sort of squarely in the camp of opposing disparate impact. And I just want to point out this watershed moment that we had this past summer when the National Fair Housing Alliance and the Center for Responsible Lending went to the major banks, major trade associations, and you see them listed there on the left-hand side. And we asked them, would you please change your mind on disparate impact? We really need you. We've been asking you for years to support disparate impact, and you never have done so. But we're asking you to change your minds at this particular moment in time. And they did. I describe it as a watershed moment. It was a time when we really saw a pivot in the perception and the position of these major financial and housing institutions on disparate impact. And so they now have come out in support of it. And what that means for me is they can never go back. My perspective is we can only move forward from this point in time. I have here listed just a number of other attacks and assaults on fair housing. I won't go through them all. This is not an exhaustive list, but it just gives you an idea of the level of ground we have to cover just to get back to where we were in terms of fair housing protections. I do want to comment on a couple of things, a couple of announcements made by the Biden administration. And I had to point these out because even before President Biden took office, we had asked both campaigns, both the Trump campaign and the Biden campaign, to vehemently support fair housing. The Biden campaign had told us, even before the election happened, yes, that if President Biden were elected, he would take immediate steps. And we asked for steps to be taken within on the first day, within the first 100 days, and in the first year to advance fair housing. And we're just so proud because I keep saying Biden because I'm conflating Obama and Biden. But President Biden did that. So I want to mention two things that he did. He issued a memorandum. We call it shorthand the Fair Housing Memorandum, but it is the memorandum for redressing our nation's and the federal government's history of discriminatory housing practices and policies. So this memorandum says that HUD and all federal agencies have to be working in lockstep to advance fair housing opportunities. It is a very, very strong memorandum. It is being utilized right now. It's what we need in this moment in time in order to gain ground and to make sure that all of the federal agencies are working together to remove barriers to fair housing and equal housing opportunities. The second is an executive order, and I'm sure you've heard a lot about this, the executive order on advancing racial equity. And this executive order requires all federal agencies to examine their key programs for racially equitable outcomes, to make sure that they are not inadvertently discriminating against communities of color. And this executive order is so important because we really are operating in this landscape that is highly inequitable. And I'll talk about that more in a minute. But this racial equity executive order, in tandem with the Fair Housing Memorandum, are two of the tools that we're using to really push federal agencies to adopt more fair and just policies. One of the areas that we're working with the administration on in terms of advancing fair housing is on the infrastructure bill. This infrastructure bill gives us a huge opportunity to undo and dismantle a lot of the harms that were caused by previous laws, previous rules that were put in place that created residential segregation, that segregated, that separated communities of color from opportunities. It gives us an opportunity to address some of the systemic issues, the structural barriers that are driving really horrible outcomes. We've been saying over and over again that housing is infrastructure, and we could not have been more pleased when Secretary Fudge tweeted that out. And you can see there are a lot of people who are pleased with that too, because I got almost 4,000 likes, 40,000 likes. Housing is infrastructure. That is the mantra that we are repeating over and over again. Because when you think about it, any time you're impacting infrastructure, you are automatically going to affect people's housing opportunities. And so we have to make sure that Congress is eminently aware of that and includes housing provisions in the infrastructure bill. The other thing that we're advocating is that Congress sort of cloak, if you will, the infrastructure bill in an AFFH wrapping. As we're saying, you got to recognize that infrastructure is housing. And if infrastructure is housing, anything you do related to that infrastructure bill has to affirmatively further fair housing. And one of the reasons why we are really pushing on the AFFH framework is because we're trying to help people to understand why the inclusion of that provision in the Fair Housing Act was so critically important. And you've heard me say a couple of times that our laws and our policies, and really, so there were thousands of them. So get that. And let me focus on that point for a minute. We have enacted literally thousands of laws, ordinances, and policies to create residentially segregated communities, highly inequitable communities, and to segregate communities and people of color from opportunity. All of the Black codes, all of the slave codes, the Indian Removal Act, the Repatriation Acts, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Housing Act, the National Highway Acts, all of them, all of the National Highway Acts, right? All of the restrictive covenants that were required by zoning ordinances, restrictive and exclusive zoning ordinances that were put in place to create segregation and maintain segregation. Many of those zoning ordinances are still on the books today. Right? The Homeowners Corporation Act, the Federal Housing Administration Act, all of these laws that we have passed at the federal level, the state level, and the local level, policies put in place, literally thousands of them, to create segregation, to explicitly deny housing and lending opportunities from people based on their protected class status. Many of these laws were put in place with the express purpose of engendering racial outcomes. So many of these laws were expressly racist. I mean, they were put in place through a racialized lens. All of the Black codes were put in place using race-conscious legislation. the Indian Removal Acts, all of them were put in place through a race lens. All of the repatriation laws, where people's land and their homes were literally taken from them and redistributed to the more well-heeled of our society, all of them were written and put in place through a racialized lens. We use race-conscious laws and race-conscious programs for hundreds and hundreds of years. And we have created this landscape that is highly inequitable. And we are living in this landscape today, right now. When we think about education, our schools are highly segregated, right? And when we look at schools that are located in predominantly African-American and Latino communities and compare them to schools that are in predominantly white communities, we see huge disparities. Schools in Black and Latino neighborhoods, schools on our Native American lands, they disproportionately have teachers who are not teaching in their area of expertise. They disproportionately have social studies teachers who are teaching math and science. They disproportionately do not have STEM programming. They disproportionately do not have programming designed to train children for a successful college career. They disproportionately have teachers who are more novice. So they don't have experienced teachers, they have novice teachers, unseasoned and untrained teachers. They have higher rates of turnover. They disproportionately have administrators who are not well trained, right? And so then is it any wonder that we're seeing that our students in communities who are educated in schools located in Black and Brown and Native American areas are not as well educated when they graduate? They're getting lower test scores. What else would you expect? Because the schools in those areas don't have the same resources as our schools in predominantly white neighborhoods. When it comes to healthy food options, people of color disproportionately live in what we call food deserts. Only 8% of Black people in America live in a neighborhood, in a census tract with a full service grocery store. I was just talking to a woman who heads up the social justice, the social impact investing for Morgan Stanley just yesterday. And she was sharing with me that in the early 2000s, she and her sister moved to Washington, D.C. They moved to Washington, D.C. They have been living in another state. DC is not a state. I had to throw in that plug. They were living in another state, and they actually grew up in a community that was very well resourced. They moved to Washington, D.C. in what is called the Shaw neighborhood. So if any of you are not familiar with the Shaw neighborhood in Washington, D.C., if you're familiar, you've all heard of Howard University. So Howard is located in Shaw. Used to be an overwhelmingly Black neighborhood, but she was just saying how shocked she was that there were no grocery stores 2 miles from the White House in her neighborhood, no grocery stores. So they had to go to the local bodegas. They didn't have healthy options at those local bodegas. No banks, so she had to use a check casher. This is a woman who's on a path to get a senior level executive position at Morgan Stanley and living in a Black neighborhood. It had nothing to do with her income, had nothing to do with the income of the people living in the community, but it had everything to do with the race of the folks living in that Shaw neighborhood. No banks. So she had to use a check casher, and so forth and so on. So when we think about where healthy food is situated, we see disproportionately it's not in communities of color. Healthcare, your zip code is a higher determinant of your health outcomes than your genetic code, because communities of color don't have healthcare facilities. They disproportionately do not have doctors. This is the reason why we're seeing huge disparities as it relates to the COVID pandemic and the COVID crisis, right? Black and Latino and Native Americans, and in some cases, Asian Americans are contracting and dying from the COVID crisis at much higher rates. I'll talk about that in a minute. They're not being vaccinated at the same rates. African Americans have the lowest vaccination rates in the United States of America. Why? Because there are no healthcare facilities in their communities that offer the vaccine, right? This is a vaccine that you have to have high degrees of refrigeration to store the vaccine. If your healthcare facility doesn't have a refrigeration system that can maintain that, then your healthcare facility doesn't get the vaccine. It's that plain and simple. So you see the entire landscape, and I'm not going to go through each one of these. I will say one point about healthy environments. The single most, the most significant predictor of whether or not a physical space is contaminated, has contaminated land, air, or water is the racial composition of the neighborhood. Now think about that. It's not the number of factories in the area. It's not the number of landfills in an area. It's not the number of gas stations in the area. It's the racial composition of the neighborhood. That is how much where you live matters. If you give me your address, I can tell you everything about yourself. I can tell you your credit score. I can tell you your income. I can tell you your net worth. If you give me your address, I can tell you how long you're gonna live. Because in the United States, because of segregation, race is inexplicably linked to opportunity. One of my colleagues, Fred Freiberg, who runs the Fair Housing Justice Center in New York, says, and he's been saying this for decades, that housing discrimination is killing us. And I think we're seeing that as a result of the COVID crisis and the huge disparities that we're seeing connected to COVID, right? Where you live, because of segregation and housing discrimination is disproportionately killing Black and Brown people. Not only are we seeing it in the health outcomes, but we're seeing it in terms of economic impacts, right? African Americans and Latinos are behind on their mortgage payments at 3 times the rate of our white counterparts. Asian Americans are behind at 2 times the rate of our white counterparts. Same thing with rental housing payments. So we've got these huge, huge disparities. This inequitable landscape is contributing to so many of the disparities we're seeing in our society. And that's why we have to enforce our fair housing laws and also have to make sure that we're using affirmatively furthering fair housing, that provision of the law, to create a more equitable landscape. So I do want to talk about a couple of emerging issues that we're seeing through the pandemic. One of them is the increased hate activity toward Asian Americans. This is really the saddest thing. It's really unnerving because it is directly related to the onset of the COVID pandemic. It's directly tied. Not only are we seeing upticks in just hate violence, but we're also seeing that Asian AAPI women are more likely to report hate incidents. Now, overall, 1/3 of all hate activities, 1/3 of all hate incidents occur at a person's residence. But we are seeing a little bit of difference as it relates to this particular violence happening amid the COVID crisis. About 9% of the reported hate incidents are occurring at a person's residence. So it's really important that we're reaching out to AAPI communities to educate them about the protections that are provided by the Fair Housing Act If a hate crime or hate activity occurs at a person's residence, that invokes the Fair Housing Act, right? Those folks are protected by the law. And it's our responsibility to get the word out, to let the community know that they have these protections. We're also seeing, I'm not going to say that appraisal bias has increased. What I will say is that we're more aware of it, right? And I've just got a couple of examples of here of anecdote after anecdote after anecdote of cases that our members have received related to appraisal bias. In Marin County, California, a Black couple had their property devalued by $500,000. In Denver, Colorado, an interracial couple had their property devalued by $145,000. And this case was particularly interesting. The Black husband greets the appraiser. The comps that the appraiser used were every single comp that he used. All of those comparable properties were located in predominantly Black neighborhoods. The couple orders a second appraisal. This time, the white wife greets the appraiser. Completely different set of comparables used. All of those comparables were located in predominantly white neighborhoods, same house, but resulted in a $145,000 difference. Same thing in Jacksonville, and we're getting these stories all over from all over the United States of America. So you are going to see increased attention by HUD to these appraisal bias issues. We're also seeing lots of issues related to gentrification and displacement. And I think this is happening amid the COVID crisis because of several things. First, as you saw, borrowers of color are disproportionately behind on their housing payments. People of color are disproportionately represented in jobs that are impacted by the COVID crisis. Our states have been really slow to issue out and disperse the rental payment assistance funds. So people are still behind on their mortgages. We have an extremely tight credit market. In fact, credit has been restricted more. It's been constrained more during the COVID crisis because of overlays that the regulators have required and that lenders themselves are placing on top of their credit boxes. So we have restricted credit access and borrowers of color are not able to access refinance loans to the same degree as their white counterparts. And then on top of all of that, we have an extremely shortage in terms of our housing inventory. So for that reason, housing is being less available to people. And I think that's why you're seeing increases in displacement. And then the last issue I'll touch on is tech equity. You've seen it in the news. I don't have to tell you story after story about how companies are utilizing algorithmic-based systems that are perpetuating discriminatory and biased outcomes against women, against people of color, right? We're seeing this over and over again in the employment space, in the health space, when it comes to credit card issuances, credit scoring mechanisms manifest biased outcomes against people of color and women. Tenant screening selection systems manifesting bias against people of color. We're seeing it even in the advertising space. Who gets to see what ad for what housing activity, what lending opportunity can be based on that individual's race or the racial composition of the neighborhood where the person is situated when they're trying to transact business on a digitally based advertising platform. Now, a couple of years ago, the National Fair Housing Alliance, along with some of our members, sued Facebook for just that reason, for the perpetuation of discrimination in terms of its digital marketing platform. In real estate, we're seeing biased outcomes because of the algorithms that some real estate agencies are using. And NAFA, along with several of our members, just filed a lawsuit against Redfin over this issue, which we're trying to resolve right now. The reason we're seeing so much bias in these technologies is first because data is tainted. The data itself upon which these instruments are built, the data is embedded with discriminatory information. The bias is baked into the data, right? And therefore computers are not blind. You've all heard the saying that computers are blind. No, they're not. Computers can see race, they can see gender, they can see national origin, sometimes quicker than the human eye can. The other challenging thing is that technology can actually manifest discrimination and bias at an amplified level, and it can systemize discrimination more because, again, it's computer generated, and these computers are making decisions at a really fast pace, at a really fast clip. They're making decisions at a much faster pace than human beings can. So the bias gets manifest much more broadly. It's why NAFA launched our Tech Equity Initiative just last year, which is designed to remove bias using a variety of debiasing methodologies to actually remove bias from the technologies that we use in the housing and financial services space. And then the last thing I do want to note is that because of all of the challenges that I've talked about, we've launched a new initiative called Keys Unlock Dreams, which is designed to significantly reduce the racial wealth gap and the racial homeownership gap. We're launching this initiative. It's a nationwide initiative, but we are going to be digging deep into different cities throughout the United States to work with stakeholders hand in glove to advance and expand housing opportunities for people. So please be on the lookout. Visit our website and search for Keys Unlock Dreams so you can see the resources that we're rolling out on a regular basis to help expand homeownership opportunities for folks. Okay, I'm going to stop right there and see if there are any questions, if we have time. And
yes,
I don't know who I'm turning it back over to. Okay.
Yeah, we do have time for questions, and so I would suggest to the audience that you put your questions into the chat.
I do see someone sent me a message. I don't know if it was a question for the whole group, but someone sent a question about the use of technology and how technology can be used to remove the need for physical branch location. So we're finding that's not the case. The physical presence of a bank in a neighborhood, it does a couple of things. So not only does it make it easier for people to connect with a mainstream lender, the presence of a bank in a neighborhood has an impact on whether or not people access credit from the financial mainstream. Two ways. One, people can physically see the bank in their neighborhood, and so they feel a connection. But two, the absence of a bank physically located in the neighborhood, right? The absence of that physical branch creates an opportunity for a payday lender or a check cashier to physically locate and situate itself in that community, right? And so that's what we're seeing. So we're not saying that there are no credit providers in communities of color. There are lots of credit providers in communities of color, but they're all payday lenders and check cashers and pawnbrokers and title money lenders and finance companies, right? And when consumers access credit from that fringe element, it does two things. It makes them either credit invisible, or it artificially lowers their credit score. So for example, classic FICO, which is the credit score that is required for mortgages. If you get any loan that is sold to the GSEs, goes to FHA, goes to VA, that lender must use classic FICO. You must use it. You don't have an alternative. You've got to deliver classic FICO score with that mortgage. Classic FICO dings you if you access credit outside of the financial mainstream. Now, hear what I'm saying. I'm not saying that you didn't pay it on time. That's not the question. You pay the obligation on time. Never miss a beat. You're never, ever late. But just by sheer virtue of the fact that you access credit from a finance company rather than a depository institution, classic FICO dings you. So this notion that, well, we don't really need banks, we don't need the physical branch, that's not the case. And there's so many other challenges here too that I don't have time to go into, but there are a litany of reasons why you want to have a physical branch location in your community. It drives other investments and so forth and so on.
So Lisa, one other question. How do you envision that inequities in the algorithms would be corrected or could be corrected?
That is a great question. So we're researching a lot of different mechanisms for debiasing tech. One of the things that we have learned is by diversifying the tech teams, so the teams that are actually the engineering teams that are building the tech and designing the tech, diversification is helping to improve in debiasing the tech or creating tech that is more fair. Great example of this. I helped a young lady, a data scientist, get positioned at a firm that it's an AI firm. It's called Zest AI. And they do a lot of work in terms of building AI systems for financial services providers. And this young lady, her name is Cassie Matthews. So Cassie noticed that when she was utilizing one of the systems that financial services utilize, it's called BizG. BizG is used in fair lending compliance, and it's supposed to be a system that helps you determine if a person is Black or Latino or white. She noticed that BizG always got her wrong. She's Black, but BizG always said she's white. And she said, now, why is this? And she noticed it. She picked up on the issue because she's a Black woman. If she had not been Black, she wouldn't have picked up on it, right? BizG gets me wrong. BizG is saying I'm white, I'm Black. What's the problem? So she actually is working to develop an improved AI system that increases the detection of race for fair lending compliance purposes at more than 30%. So we know that diversifying the field will greatly lead to improving the outcomes of these technology systems. Then we can also use artificial intelligence itself. We can use technology itself to debias systems and to make them more fair and have less discriminatory outcomes.
Lisa, one final question. What do you think of the idea that gentrification is intentional instead of the result of naturally occurring market forces?
Well, yes, of course. In some cases, it is intentional. We know that, right? and you can see that in marketing materials that some developers pull together for their investors, right? It's plain that they want to change. They want to change the character of the people who are going to be living in the new housing units that they're building. We see this in Washington, D.C. We had quite a few affordable housing developments that had 3, 4, and 5 bedroom units. Those developments were torn down and replaced with single occupancy, 1 bedroom and 2 bedroom units. Well, that's deliberate. All right. That's deliberate. You're moving out families with children. You're moving out Latino households. You're moving out Black households. You're moving out Asian American households. That's deliberate. And it's a beef I have with the District of Columbia for letting that happen. So yeah, of course, a lot of it is deliberate and some of it is unintentional as well.
Well, thank you, Lisa. I think now we're going to go to our closing remarks. We would love to continue asking you questions for the rest of the afternoon, but I think we'll end here and move to closing out the conference. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
I'm next. Good afternoon, everyone. That was such good information. I'm sure we all can agree. Can everyone hear me well? Okay. Again, I am Chalisa Williams, the Vice Chair of the City of Raleigh Fair Housing Hearing Board. And on behalf of the Hearing Board, we want to extend our sincere gratitudes to everyone who joins this call, for everyone who come to the conference today. We wanted to send a special thank you to the Fair Housing Project of Legal Aid North Carolina. We appreciate your continued advocacy and support on our board's behalf. And your time, your input, and unwavering, bold support. Thank you. To Demetrius in the Office of Equity and Inclusion, we appreciate your dedication to the cause and your guidance. And to all of you again who joined us today, thank you for being here. And after years of fighting for a cause that affect, and after year after year supporting us, fighting for a cause that affects so many Americans. The reason we gathered today is because everyone on this call share common belief that every American deserves an equal opportunity, regardless of the mistakes they've made, where they come from, what they look like, how they view themselves, who they love, how they love, where they worship, and without barriers. Housing discrimination is not only wrong, it's illegal. And in a country that's supposedly founded on the principles of justice and equality for all, we know that have not been the case. We have all turned on our TVs or picked up a newspaper to realize that even after the passing of this landmark law 53 years ago when it was signed, we have work to do. We have laws to create, we have systems to fix, and we have voices that we must use to speak up and work together to hold our officials accountable while we work together and dismantle the barriers that tell us that we don't deserve equity, equality, opportunity, fair education, and housing. With 53 years later, we're still fighting for change. 53 years later, we're still marching for justice. 53 years later, we're still experiencing segregation and discriminations. Although it's been 53 years, pat yourselves on the back. and then pull up your bootstraps, because we are just getting started. The work is now being started. We have work to do. 53 years later, there's more work to do. But although it's been 53 years, we are just as resilient. We're just as powerful. We're just as hopeful, and we will not be ignored. Matter of fact, there's no way to silence us now. So I just wanted to leave you all with that. We appreciate you all for your support again. And on behalf of the City of Raleigh Fair Housing Hearing Board, thank you. Before I do let you go, I want to let you know that it'll be a brief survey about, I think, maybe 4 or 5 questions. If everyone can take a couple minutes to complete it, to provide us with some feedback, we will greatly appreciate that.
And if folks could, just the Fair Housing Project also has just a few closing remarks to add on to that before folks do their final evaluation, if that's possible.
Okay, got you. Well, I'll turn it over to you, Jack.
Great, thank you, Lisa. And thank you again, Lisa, for your excellent keynote presentation, providing us with an important national perspective. In keeping with Lisa's remarks and Shalisa's, I encourage everybody watching today to become more engaged in our joint effort to further fair housing here in North Carolina. Each of us is needed in the fight for a fair North Carolina, free of housing discrimination in all its forms and free of racial and ethnic segregation. I also want to thank each of the panelists today for their presentations, and especially thank the entire staff of the Fair Housing Project. This conference would not have occurred without all of their hard work putting it together. Finally, I need to thank our conference co-host, the Raleigh Fair Housing Hearing Board of the City of Raleigh, for again partnering with us here at Legal Aid of North Carolina to help create this conference. Thank you all again, and just to echo Chalisa's remarks before, please, before you sign off, fill out the evaluation that is going to pop up on your screen after my remarks. Thank you.